Hello. And welcome, to those joining for the first time, welcome to Shadow's Lair, and to those who keep coming back. Welcome back, tonight. We're not starting with something loud, not something obvious, because the things that truly stay with you rarely begin that way. There's a moment, so small you almost miss it, a pause in the air, a shift in the silence, nothing moves, nothing changes, and yet something feels off. Not enough to scare you. Not enough to make you react. Just enough to make you hesitate. Maybe it's the way the room suddenly feels colder, or how the silence starts to feel heavier. Like it's not empty anymore. Like something is there. Just beyond your awareness, you tell yourself it's nothing. You always do, a trick of the mind, a passing thought, an overreaction, so you ignore it, you move on, you forget it ever happened, but later, when it's quiet again, when you're alone, that same feeling comes back, stronger this time, closer, and that's when you realize, that moment you ignored wasn't the beginning, it was the invitation, because whatever is out there doesn't arrive all at once, it doesn't force its way in, it doesn't need to, it waits, patient, unseen, certain, it watches. Until you notice it, and the second you do, something changes, tonight. We're diving into 3 encounters where that moment, that feeling, was the only warning they ever got, a knock that comes at the same time. Every night. Soft at first. Then impossible to ignore, a house built with no logic. No pattern. As if it was never meant to make sense to the people living inside it, and a forgotten room where the silence doesn't feel empty. Because something in it never left. 3 stories, no obvious connection, just the same quiet beginning. The same mistake. And the same question, what happens when you finally notice? Let's begin. Story 1. 3 a.m. knock ignored forever. There's a rule most people laugh at. Until it happens to them. Not because it sounds ridiculous. Not because it feels impossible. But because nothing happens the first time. Or the second. Or even the third. And that's how it earns your trust. If you hear a knock at your door at exactly 3 a.m. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Perfectly spaced. Do not answer it. Not out of fear. Not out of superstition. But because the moment you treat it like something normal, you've already started listening. And it listens back. Because sometimes, it's not someone trying to get in. There's no one standing outside. No visitor. No stranger. No one who needs help. Sometimes, it's something that doesn't need the door at all. Something that isn't trying to enter your house, but trying to make sure you let it into something far worse. Your voice. Your thoughts. Your sense of what is real. And the most dangerous part, it doesn't force anything. It waits. Patiently. Silently. Until you do the one thing it needs. Until you respond. Because the moment you do, it doesn't matter how small it was. A whisper. A word. A breath you didn't control. That's enough. That's always enough. And from that moment on, it stops knocking to be heard. And starts knocking. To replace. Arjun never believed in superstition. He had grown up around it, Neighbors who wouldn't cut their nails after sunset, relatives who whispered about shadows crossing thresholds. Stories told in hushed tones whenever the power went out, but he had always treated it like background noise. Cultural residue. Harmless, outdated, easy to ignore, living alone on the outskirts of the city suited that mindset perfectly. Silence wasn't unsettling to him. It was relief. No traffic bleeding into his thoughts, no late-night conversations through thin apartment walls, no interruptions. Just space. Just stillness. Just control. The house had been cheaper than anything else he had seen, which should have been a warning. But instead, it felt like luck. Old, yes. But sturdy, a colonial-era structure with thick, aging walls that held on to the day's heat and released it slowly at night. Long corridors stretched deeper than they seemed, creating the illusion of space that wasn't quite there. Doors lined those corridors, each one slightly different, each one carrying its own quiet personality. Some creaked. Some resisted. Some opened too easily, as if they had been waiting, perfect for someone who liked solitude. The first night passed without incident. So did the second. By the third, Arjun had settled into a rhythm. Work, dinner, a bit of scrolling on his phone, and then sleep. The silence became familiar, almost comforting in the way it wrapped around him. Until Tuesday night. The knock came without warning. 3 a.m. Not around 3. Not close enough to be coincidence. Exactly 3 a.m., knock. 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 3 slow, deliberate taps. Arjun stirred in his sleep, his mind pulling itself reluctantly out of a dream he couldn't remember. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the darkness that filled the room. For a few seconds, he didn't move. Didn't think. Just existed in that strange space between sleep and awareness. Then the sound settled into his memory. He reached for his phone, the screen lighting up his face with a dull glow. 3 a.m. He frowned, the number anchoring him fully into wakefulness. Who knocks at this hour? He pushed himself up slightly. Listening, the house responded with nothing. No footsteps, no shifting shadows, no follow-up sound, just silence. He stayed like that for a while, his body alert, his ears straining for anything that might explain what he had heard. The silence felt thicker now, less like absence and more like something deliberate, like the house had decided to hold its breath. He waited, seconds stretched into something longer, still nothing. Arjun exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Probably just the wind, he muttered, more out of habit than belief. Saying it out loud made it easier to accept. Easier to dismiss. He lay back down, adjusting his pillow, forcing his body to relax. The silence returned to what it had been before. Empty. Harmless. Familiar, but somewhere in the back of his mind, something didn't settle, because the wind didn't knock, and it definitely didn't knock in patterns. He closed his eyes anyway. Sleep came slower this time, and just before it did, in that fragile moment where awareness begins to fade, a thought surfaced, uninvited, unwelcome, and impossible to shake. It had been 3 knocks. Not random. Not accidental, measured, intentional, as if something hadn't been trying to get in, but simply checking if anyone was there. The second night, it happened again, 3 a.m., not a second early. Not a second late, exactly 3 a.m., knock. Knock. Knock, same rhythm. Same spacing. Same calm, measured taps that felt less like urgency and more like certainty. Arjun's eyes opened instantly this time. No confusion. No disorientation. He was awake the moment the first knock landed. He didn't move, didn't sit up, didn't even turn his head. He just listened. His body stayed still under the blanket, but inside, everything had tightened. His chest rose slowly, carefully, as if even breathing too loudly might matter. His ears strained against the silence that followed, waiting for something, anything, that would explain it away. Nothing came, only the echo of those 3 knocks lingering in his mind, replaying with unnatural clarity. His heart began to pound, each beat louder than the last, until it felt like it might give him away. The sound filled his ears, drowning out the silence, making it harder to tell if anything else was happening beyond his room. "Someone's messing with me," he whispered, the words barely forming, more breath than sound. It didn't feel convincing. Still, he reached slowly toward his bedside table, fingers brushing against his phone. The screen lit up, the sudden glow cutting through the darkness. For a moment, it felt too bright, too intrusive, like it didn't belong in that room anymore. 3 a.m. Still, exactly. He swallowed, then navigated to the security app. The front door camera should have given him clarity, something solid to hold on to. A prank. A passerby. A stray animal brushing against the door. Something normal. The feed loaded, static, not grainy footage. Not low-light distortion, pure. Shifting static, the screen flickered in uneven pulses, as if the signal itself was struggling to exist. Lines of interference crawled across the display, distorting the image into something unrecognizable. Arjun frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen. "That's not possible," he murmured. The camera had worked fine all day. Crystal clear. No issues. He adjusted the angle, refreshed the feed. Static. The flickering grew harsher for a moment, the interference intensifying as though something was pressing against the signal from the other side. Then, for a brief second, the static parted. Not completely, just enough. A shape appeared, standing directly in front of the door. Arjun's breath caught. It wasn't clear. Not fully visible. More like a silhouette trying to form through interference. But there was no mistaking it. A figure, too tall. Its head seemed just slightly higher than the doorframe should allow, its proportions stretched in a way that didn't align with anything human. It didn't shift. Didn't sway. Didn't even seem to breathe. It was just there, perfectly still, as if it had been standing there long before the camera turned on, as if it knew it was being watched. The image glitched violently. The static surged back in, swallowing the figure whole, and then nothing. Just static again. Arjun stared at the screen, his grip tightening unconsciously. His mouth had gone dry, his thoughts stumbling over themselves, trying to assemble something logical from what he had just seen. "A trick," he said under his breath. "A glitch. Just a glitch." But the words felt hollow the moment he said them, because glitches didn't feel like that. They didn't leave behind the impression of being observed. They didn't linger. He waited. The camera feed remained useless. The house remained silent. No footsteps. No movement. No second knock. Just that same heavy, deliberate quiet pressing in from all sides. Arjun slowly lowered the phone, his gaze drifting toward the door of his room. It was slightly ajar, just enough for the darkness of the hallway to seep through. He hadn't left it like that. He was sure of it. A faint unease curled tighter in his chest. The front door was locked. He remembered locking it, double-checking it. But the thought that followed came uninvited, slipping into his mind with quiet persistence. What if the knock wasn't asking to come in? What if it was just letting him know it was already there? Arjun shut his eyes briefly, forcing the thought away. No, he wasn't going to spiral. He wasn't going to turn this into something it wasn't. He placed the phone back on the table, turned onto his side, and pulled the blanket slightly higher. He didn't open the door. He didn't go to check. He didn't respond, and that decision saved him, or at least, delayed something worse, because somewhere beyond the static, beyond the silence, beyond the reach of anything he could see or understand, something had just confirmed the pattern, and patterns, once formed, don't stop on their own. By the fourth night, the knocks had changed. They no longer carried that calm, deliberate patience. There was something else behind them now, something tighter, more focused, less willing to wait. 3 a.m. Exactly. Knock. Knock. Knock, faster, sharper. More demanding. Arjun didn't need to check the time anymore. His eyes opened the moment the first knock landed, his body already tense, already expecting it. Sleep had become shallow over the past few nights, never fully settling, always hovering just beneath awareness as if his mind refused to let go completely. He lay still, staring into the darkness, every nerve alert. The sound felt closer tonight, not louder, closer, as if the distance between him and whatever stood on the other side of that door had somehow shortened. The knocks came again. Knock. Knock. Knock, impatient, not testing anymore, insisting. Arjun clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to react, not to move, not to acknowledge it in any way. The old man's words from the tea stall drifted back into his thoughts, uninvited but impossible to ignore. If it knocks at 3 a.m. you do not answer. He wasn't going to. He stayed silent, and then, a voice, Arjun. His blood froze instantly, his body locking in place as if the sound itself had reached into him and shut something down. That wasn't possible. No one should know he was here. He had moved quietly, intentionally. Only a handful of people even knew he had left his previous place, and none of them had visited. None of them had any reason to be standing outside his door at 3 in the morning. The voice came again. Arjun. Open the door. It sounded wrong, not distorted in the way a bad speaker or a broken recording might sound. Not muffled or unclear, clear, too clear, but empty, flat, every word perfectly shaped, perfectly pronounced, but completely devoid of anything human behind it. No urgency. No fear. No warmth. Just sound arranged into something that resembled language, like someone had learned how to speak by listening, but never understood what speaking actually meant. Arjun's throat tightened. He didn't move, didn't respond, didn't even let his breathing change. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing down on him, waiting for something, anything. The voice returned, closer, not by much, just enough. Arjun. This time, the sound didn't come from the door, it came from somewhere else, somewhere inside the house. His eyes snapped toward his bedroom entrance. The door was still slightly ajar, the darkness of the hallway stretching beyond it like a space that didn't quite belong to the rest of the house anymore. Arjun. There it was again, clearer now, no longer filtered through walls or distance. It was in the hallway. Something inside him broke free of its paralysis, and he shot upright in bed, his heart slamming violently against his ribs. The blanket fell away, the sudden movement loud in the silence, too loud, like it didn't belong. The knocking had stopped, completely. No echo, no continuation, just absence, and in its place, presence, a shift in the air, subtle, but undeniable. The house didn't feel empty anymore. The silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was occupied. Arjun swung his legs over the side of the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark gap of the doorway. His mind raced, trying to construct something logical, something explainable, something real. Someone broke in, that's all. Someone got inside, that's what this is. But the thought didn't settle, it didn't fit, because he hadn't heard the door open. Hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard anything except those 3 knocks, and now, Arjun. The voice came again, from the hallway, closer than before, not moving in steps, just Closer, as if distance didn't apply to it the way it should. Arjun's chest tightened. His instinct screamed at him to stay where he was, to remain silent, to become as still as possible. But something else, something equally strong, urged him to look. To confirm. To face whatever was out there and prove to himself that it was something real, something human. He stood up slowly, every movement careful, controlled, as if the air itself might react to sudden motion. The floor creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoed farther than it should have, and for a brief moment, the voice stopped, completely, as if it had been interrupted, as if it was listening, waiting. Arjun took a step toward the door, then another. His breath came shallow now, his pulse loud in his ears, drowning out everything else. He reached the doorway, paused. The hallway stretched before him, dimly visible in the faint light spilling from his room. The walls seemed darker than before, the shadows thicker, clinging to corners in a way that felt almost intentional. Empty, nothing there, no movement, no figure, no explanation. He stared into it, his eyes scanning, searching, trying to find anything that justified what he had heard. Seconds passed. Nothing changed. He let out a slow breath, tension loosening just slightly. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe the stress, the lack of sleep, the isolation. It was getting to him. It had to be that. It had to be something internal. Because the alternative, Arjun. The voice came from right behind him, not loud, not whispered, just there, close enough to feel. Arjun's entire body locked. The air near his ear felt colder, not dramatically, just enough to notice, enough to know. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned his head, but there was nothing there, no one, just the empty space of his room, unchanged, unmoved, silent. His heart pounded harder, confusion mixing with fear in a way that made it difficult to think, difficult to breathe, difficult to trust anything his senses were telling him, because something didn't add up. If it wasn't in front of him, if it wasn't behind him, then where? A sound interrupted the thought, soft, faint, from the hallway. Again, not a voice this time, not a knock, something else, a subtle shift, a presence withdrawing, not leaving, just pulling back. Arjun stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to catch up, to understand what had just happened. The knocking had stopped, the voice had moved, and now, something was inside the house with him, not trying to get in anymore, not waiting outside, but already there, and worse, it knew his name. The next morning, Arjun didn't wait. Sleep had come in fragments, shallow and unreliable, slipping away the moment his mind drifted too close to the memory of that voice. By the time sunlight pushed weakly through the narrow windows, he was already awake, already dressed, already out of the house. The silence outside felt different in daylight. Less oppressive. Less aware. But it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't soften it. If anything, it made it feel more real, because nothing looked wrong. The road stretched out the same way it had yesterday, quiet, mostly empty, lined with patches of overgrown grass and the occasional abandoned structure. Birds moved through the trees. A distant vehicle passed once, its sound fading quickly into nothing. Normal, too normal. Arjun walked faster than he intended, his mind fixed on one thing, answers. The tea stall wasn't far. A small structure at a bend in the road, patched together with tin sheets and wood, its presence marked more by habit than visibility. A few plastic chairs sat scattered around it. And a kettle hissed softly over a gas flame, sending up thin spirals of steam. Two men stood nearby, speaking quietly. They glanced at Arjun as he approached, their conversation pausing just long enough to acknowledge him before resuming in lower tones. The stall owner gave him a brief nod. Chai. Arjun hesitated, then nodded back. Yeah. He took a seat, his eyes scanning the area, searching for something he couldn't quite define. Something that would confirm that what he experienced wasn't isolated. That it belonged to this place, not just to him. The tea arrived quickly. Hot. Strong. Familiar and grounding. He took a sip, letting the warmth settle his nerves just enough to speak. That house up the road, he began, trying to keep his tone casual, controlled. The old one. Does anyone know much about it? The conversation nearby stopped completely this time. Silence spread, not the heavy kind from the house, but something more human. More deliberate. One of the men avoided eye contact. The other shifted slightly, as if preparing to leave, but it was the old man sitting at the far end who responded. He hadn't moved when Arjun arrived. Hadn't spoken. Hadn't even looked up, until now. You're staying there? The old man asked, his voice quiet but steady. Arjun nodded. The old man studied him for a long moment. His eyes sharp in a way that didn't match his age. Then he exhaled slowly, as if confirming something to himself. You heard the knock, didn't you? The words landed heavier than expected. Arjun felt his grip tighten slightly around the cup. He didn't answer immediately. Didn't deflect. Didn't pretend. He just nodded, slowly. The old man leaned forward just enough to close the distance between them, his voice dropping lower, not out of secrecy, but certainty. There are rules. Arjun frowned slightly. Rules? Not the answer he was expecting, not something that made sense, but it felt important. The old man didn't rush. Didn't dramatize. He spoke like someone repeating something that had already been proven. If it knocks at 3 a.m., you do not answer. Arjun nodded again, more firmly this time. I didn't. For a brief second, something shifted in the old man's expression, relief, but it didn't last. It faded quickly, replaced by something darker. Something more complicated. Good, the old man said quietly. Because if you had, it wouldn't be outside anymore. The word settled into Arjun's chest, cold and heavy. Not outside anymore. He swallowed. What is it? He asked, the question slipping out before he could soften it, before he could pretend he didn't want to know. The old man shook his head slowly. Doesn't matter. That answer frustrated something in Arjun, a small part of him still holding on to logic, onto the idea that everything had an explanation waiting to be uncovered. How does it not matter? He pressed. The old man met his gaze again, this time without hesitation. Because knowing what it is won't help you, he said. Understanding it won't stop it. There was no fear in his voice, just certainty. It learns you. Arjun's brow tightened. Learns me? The phrase didn't sit right, didn't make sense. The old man nodded slightly, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the table, slow and deliberate, almost echoing something else. It listens, he said. Watches. Understands how you speak, how you sound. How you trust. Each word landed with careful precision, like something rehearsed, something passed down exactly as it needed to be. Arjun felt his stomach tighten. Images from the night before surfaced instantly. The voice in the hallway, the way it had said his name, the way it had sounded almost right. But not enough. It doesn't rush, the old man continued. It doesn't force anything. It waits. For what? Arjun asked quietly. The old man leaned in just slightly more. His voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. For you to respond. A faint breeze passed through the stall, shifting the hanging plastic sheet near the entrance. The sound it made, a soft, uneven flap, felt too close to something else, too familiar. Arjun didn't look away. and once it knows you well enough. The old man said, his eyes locking onto his with a weight that made it impossible to ignore, "It stops knocking." The words lingered, not just in the air, inside him, because something about them felt less like a warning, and more like a timeline. That night, Arjun prepared, not out of confidence, but out of necessity. He moved through the house with a kind of deliberate awareness he hadn't felt before, checking every door, every window, every possible entry point. Locks clicked into place one by one, the sound sharp in the quiet, almost reassuring in its finality. He double-checked them. Then checked them again. It didn't help. The house still felt open, not physically, but in a way he couldn't define. He turned on every light he could, filling the rooms with a dull, artificial brightness that pushed back the shadows but didn't remove them completely. Corners still felt darker than they should. Hallways still stretched a little too far. The basement door at the end of the corridor remained closed, untouched, but somehow more present than anything else in the house. He avoided looking at it. His phone sat beside him, camera app open, recording. Proof. That's what he told himself. If something happened, he would have proof. Something real. Something he could replay in daylight and make sense of. But a small, quiet part of him already knew, whatever this was. It wouldn't care about being recorded. Arjun sat on his bed, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door to his room. The light from the hallway spilled in, stretching across the floor, stopping just short of his feet. Time passed slowly, each minute heavier than the last. His breathing became measured, controlled, as if he were trying not to disturb something already watching. Then, 3 a.m., exactly, knock. 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 The sound cut cleanly through the silence, sharper tonight, more defined, like it had shed whatever hesitation it once carried. Arjun didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even let his chest rise fully. The knocks didn't repeat immediately. They lingered, as if waiting. He stayed silent, still, invisible, if he could manage it. Seconds stretched. Then, a voice. Arjun. It's me. His heart skipped so hard it hurt. That was his voice. Not similar, not close, exact, every tone, every subtle inflection, every unconscious rhythm he had never noticed in himself. It was all there, perfectly replicated, coming from the other side of the door. I forgot my keys. Open the door. The word sounded natural. Casual. Familiar in a way that dug into him deeper than fear. It wasn't just imitation, it was understanding. Arjun's hands clenched into fists, his nails pressing into his palms hard enough to ground him. No, 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 no. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge it, didn't let it in, because that's what it wanted. That's what the old man had said. It waits for you to respond. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. Then, the handle moved, slowly, gently, not forced, not aggressive, just testing, turning slightly, stopping, then turning back, as if something was learning how it worked. Arjun's breath caught in his throat. The door was locked. He had checked it. He knew it was locked, and yet, the sound of the handle moving felt wrong. Too smooth, too practiced. The voice came again, but it wasn't his anymore. It shifted, changed, not gradually, instantly. Beta. Open the door. I'm scared. Arjun's entire body froze, his vision blurred for a second as something inside him collapsed under the weight of that voice. His mother. It sounded like her, not just the tone. Not just the words, everything, the softness. The slight tremble. The way she used to say Beta when she needed him, when she wanted him to listen, when she wanted him to feel responsible. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. His chest tightened painfully, memories surfacing without permission, dragging him backward into something warm and familiar and impossible. beta. Please. The voice cracked slightly this time, perfectly, too perfectly. Arjun shook his head slowly, his body resisting something his mind struggled to hold on to. No, something was wrong, something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, because his mother had been dead for 5 years. He had seen her, he had stood there, he had said goodbye. That voice didn't belong here, it didn't belong anywhere, Arjun. It said again, shifting between tones, between identities, as if trying different keys until it found the one that unlocked him. The handle moved again, a little more this time, a little longer. Arjun's breathing grew uneven, his control slipping under the pressure, under the emotional pull, under the sheer wrongness of what he was hearing. It wasn't just mimicking anymore, it was selecting, choosing, testing what worked, what got a reaction, what brought him closer to answering. His fists tightened harder, he pressed his back against the wall, forcing himself to stay in place, forcing himself not to speak, not to break, not to give it anything, because now he understood something the old man hadn't fully explained. It didn't just learn your voice, it learned what mattered. Open the door. The voice softened again, familiar, comforting, dangerous. Arjun shut his eyes tightly, tears slipping down his face in silence. He didn't respond, he couldn't, because the moment he did, the moment he acknowledged it, it wouldn't need to pretend anymore. The handle stopped moving, the voice stopped speaking, and for a long moment, there was nothing, just silence. But this time, it didn't feel like absence, it felt like completion, like something had gathered enough, learned enough, understood enough, and somewhere, just beyond the door, beyond the light, beyond the reach of anything he could see, something had just realized, it knew him. Sleep deprivation broke him, not suddenly. Not in a dramatic collapse or a moment of panic, it wore him down. Night after night, the pattern repeated, 3 a.m., the knock, the voice, the waiting. Each time he resisted, each time he stayed silent, each time he held himself together just long enough for it to end. But the body keeps score, the mind, no matter how strong, begins to fray when rest is denied long enough. By the 7th night, Arjun wasn't thinking clearly anymore. The house felt closer. Smaller. Like the walls had shifted inward just slightly, enough to be noticed but not proven. The lights felt harsher. The shadows thicker. Even during the day, something lingered in the corners of his vision, slipping away the moment he tried to focus on it. He stopped trusting silence, because silence didn't mean absence anymore. It meant waiting. That night, he didn't prepare the way he had before. The doors were still locked. The lights were still on. The phone still sat beside him, recording, but he wasn't in control. He sat on the bed, shoulders slumped, eyes heavy, blinking slower than they should. His thoughts drifted in and out, slipping between awareness and exhaustion. For brief moments, he almost slept, only to jerk awake again, heart racing, unsure if he had heard something or imagined it. Time blurred, minutes stretched and collapsed into each other, and then, 3 a.m., the knock came. Knock. Knock. Knock, same rhythm, same intention, but it didn't hit him the same way anymore. There was no sharp spike of fear, no immediate tension, just a dull, familiar weight settling into the room. Arjun didn't move, didn't sit up, didn't even fully open his eyes. He knew it was there, he knew what would come next, and a part of him, small, broken, exhausted, just wanted it to stop. The silence followed, longer this time, deeper, as if something was waiting for a different kind of response. No voice came. No attempt to mimic, no testing, just stillness, and that stillness did something worse than fear, it invited thought. Arjun's mind drifted, unfocused, slipping between logic and impulse, between awareness and fatigue. His body felt heavy, his chest tight, his thoughts slower, softer, easier to ignore. Just say something. The idea didn't feel dangerous. It didn't feel like a rule being broken. It felt simple, harmless, a whisper, that's all, not opening the door. Not answering fully. Just enough to make it stop, just enough to reclaim control. His lips parted slightly, his voice barely formed, go away. The words slipped out like breath, soft, weak, almost nothing, but it was enough. Silence followed, complete, absolute, no knock, no voice, no shifting air, nothing, for the first time in days. There was no response. Arjun's eyes opened slowly, fully. The stillness in the room felt different now, lighter, empty again. The weight that had been pressing against him night after night, gone. He exhaled deeply, his body sagging as relief washed over him in a slow, overwhelming wave. His muscles loosened. His chest relaxed. His thoughts cleared just enough to feel something close to victory. It worked. It stopped. He leaned back slightly, running a hand over his face, his breathing steadying for the first time in what felt like forever. I should have done that earlier. He muttered quietly. The words barely left his mouth, and that's when he heard it, right behind him. Close, too close. Now I know how you sound. The voice was perfect, not just similar, not just accurate, perfect, every tone. Every subtle imperfection. Every natural rhythm he had never been aware of. It was his voice, speaking back to him. Arjun's entire body went rigid, the relief draining from him instantly, replaced by something far colder, far deeper than fear, understanding. Slowly, very slowly, his mind caught up to what had just happened. It hadn't needed him to open the door. It hadn't needed him to let it in. It just needed him to respond. To give it something real, something it couldn't imitate without permission, his voice. And now, it had it. The air behind him shifted slightly, not with movement, but with presence, something standing where nothing should be, something that hadn't been there a second ago, or maybe, something that had always been there, waiting for him to make the mistake. The lights flickered, once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed everything. Not the kind of darkness that comes from turning off a switch. Not the soft, familiar dimness of night. This was heavier. Immediate. Absolute. As if the light hadn't just disappeared, but had been taken. Arjun froze where he sat, his breath catching halfway in his chest. For a second, his mind refused to process it. The house had never lost power before. Not once. Not even during the worst weather. This wasn't normal. This wasn't coincidence. The silence deepened around him, thick and suffocating. Even the faint hum of electricity that usually lingered in the background was gone. No appliances. No distant sounds. Nothing, just him, and something else. Slowly, painfully slowly, Arjun turned his head. His eyes struggled against the darkness at first, trying to adjust, trying to find shapes, outlines, anything familiar to hold on to. The room began to take form in fragments. The edge of the bed, the faint outline of the wall, the open doorway spilling nothing but deeper black into the space. And then, the corner. Something stood there, not moved into place, not emerging, just there, as if it had always been part of the room, waiting for the light to disappear before allowing itself to be seen. Arjun's breath stopped completely. It was tall, too tall. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling, forcing its body into a slight bend that didn't look natural, didn't look comfortable, if comfort was something it even understood. Its limbs were elongated, stretched in subtle, uneven ways, as if someone had taken the proportions of a human form and pulled them just far enough to break something essential, unnatural, wrong. Its arms hung at its sides, too long, the fingers extending just a bit further than they should, ending in shapes that weren't Quite visible, but didn't need to be. Arjun couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even convince himself that what he was seeing wasn't real, because it felt real, more real than anything else in that moment. And then, its face, his vision sharpened just enough to see it clearly, and when he did, something inside him broke. It was his face, not similar, not close, exact, every feature. Every line. Every detail, perfectly replicated, but the expression was wrong. It was smiling, too wide, too still, too deliberate, not a reflection of emotion, but an imitation of it, like someone had studied what a smile looked like. And then recreated it without understanding why it existed. Arjun stumbled back slightly, his hand hitting the wall behind him as his body tried to create distance that didn't matter anymore. "You opened the door," it said. The voice was his. "Flawless." "I didn't." Arjun screamed, the words tearing out of him before he could stop them, before he could think, before he could remember that speaking had consequences. The thing didn't react to the volume, didn't flinch, didn't pause. It simply tilted its head slightly, the movement slow, curious, as if observing something interesting. "You spoke." The words came out with quiet certainty, not accusation, not anger, just fact. Arjun's chest heaved, panic rising fast now, too fast to control. "That's not the same," he said, his voice breaking under the pressure, under the fear, under the realization that he had crossed something invisible but irreversible. The thing took a step forward. No, not a step. It moved. Its body shifted without sound, without effort, gliding across the floor in a way that didn't disturb the air, didn't create friction, didn't follow the rules of movement. Arjun understood. Closer. Each inch it covered made the room feel smaller, tighter, more confined. Same thing. The smile didn't change, didn't flicker, didn't soften. It remained fixed, stretched across his own face in a way that made it unrecognizable. Arjun shook his head, backing away again, his movements clumsy now, uncoordinated, driven by instinct rather than thought. "No, I didn't let you in," he said, the words desperate, pleading, searching for logic that no longer applied. But even as he said it, he knew. The door hadn't mattered, the lock hadn't mattered, the boundary had never been physical. It had been something else, something simpler, something he had broken the moment he spoke. The thing moved closer again, now only a few steps away. Close enough for him to see the details more clearly, close enough to notice the small imperfections. The way the skin didn't quite sit right, the way the eyes, his eyes, held no depth. No reflection, no life behind them, just awareness, cold, complete, watching, learning, finished learning. Arjun's back hit the wall fully now, nowhere left to go, nowhere left to create distance. His breathing came fast, uneven, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. "You don't need the door anymore," it said softly, its voice lowered slightly, matching his tone from earlier, matching the exact cadence of his fear, because now, it didn't just sound like him, it understood him, and somewhere in that understanding, in that perfect imitation, in that quiet, impossible presence standing in front of him, Arjun realized something far worse than being trapped. He realized he was no longer alone inside himself. Arjun ran, not out of strategy, not out of clarity, out of instinct. His body moved before his mind could catch up, driven by something older than thought, something that understood one thing with terrifying certainty: he couldn't stay there. He stumbled out of his room, nearly losing his balance as his shoulder clipped the edge of the doorway. The darkness in the hallway felt thicker now, heavier, as if it had weight, as if it resisted movement. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. His footsteps pounded against the floor, louder than they should have been, echoing unnaturally, stretching down the corridor in ways that didn't make sense. The walls seemed closer, the distance longer, the house subtly rearranging itself around him in ways too small to notice consciously, but impossible to ignore. Behind him, nothing, no footsteps, no pursuit, no sound at all, and that was worse, because something didn't need to chase him, it already knew where he was going, the front door, that was the only thought in his mind, out, he needed to get out. The corridor stretched, then narrowed, then stretched again, the perspective shifting in a way that made his head spin. Doors on either side passed him too slowly, then too quickly, their handles catching glints of nothing in the absence of light. For a brief second, he thought he saw something move in one of the doorways, a shadow that didn't match the darkness around it. But he didn't look again. Looking meant slowing. Slowing meant stopping. And stopping wasn't an option anymore. He reached the front door. It stood exactly where it should, unchanged, solid. Real, his hand hit the handle. Hard, fingers slipping for a second before finding their grip. He twisted it violently. The mechanism giving way with a sharp, familiar click that cut through everything else. The door opened. Fresh air hit him like a wave, cold, sharp, real. It flooded into his lungs, breaking through the suffocating stillness of the house, grounding him instantly. The sensation was overwhelming, almost painful, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long without realizing it. He stumbled outside, his feet hitting uneven ground as he caught himself, his body leaning forward, his hands bracing against his knees, panting, breathing hard, alive. Behind him, the doorway stood open, spilling darkness into the night. He didn't look at it immediately. He couldn't. Relief washed over him in waves. Heavy and disorienting. His heart pounded violently, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts as he tried to steady himself. Safe, that thought formed slowly, uncertain at first, then stronger. He made it out. Whatever was in there, it couldn't follow him here, couldn't cross that boundary, couldn't leave the house, or so he thought, because something didn't feel right. The air was cold, but it didn't move. No wind, no distant sounds, no insects. No signs of life. Arjun straightened slowly, his breathing still uneven as his eyes adjusted to the space around him. Something was missing, not visually, not immediately, but fundamentally. The world felt incomplete. He turned, slowly, carefully, expecting to see the house behind him, the old structure, the doorway, the familiar outline of something real, but there was nothing there. The house was gone, not hidden, not obscured, gone, replaced by darkness. Not the kind of darkness that comes from night. This was deeper, endless, a void that stretched beyond sight, beyond distance, beyond anything his mind could measure or understand. It didn't reflect light, it didn't absorb. It simply existed, and it replaced everything. Arjun's breath caught again, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, trying to force it into something logical, something possible, but logic had stopped applying the moment he opened that door, because this wasn't outside, this wasn't escape, this was something else, something constructed, something designed. Within the void, shapes began to form, faint at first, barely visible, then clearer, more defined. Doors. Countless doors, stretching in every direction, above, below, beside him, all identical, same wood, same handle, same presence, each one a perfect copy of the door he had just run through. They stood suspended in the darkness, arranged without pattern, without order, without end. Arjun turned slowly, his eyes moving from one to the next, his mind trying to grasp the scale of it. There were too many to count, too many to comprehend. And then, the sound. It started with one, knock. 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 Distant, muted, then another, closer, knock. Knock. Knock, then more, spreading, layering, overlapping. until the silence shattered completely. Knocking filled the void, from every direction, every door, each one carrying the same rhythm, the same intention, the same deliberate pattern he had heard night after night. Arjun covered his ears instinctively, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just around him, it was inside him, resonating, repeating, endless. He staggered back, his footing unstable on nothingness, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts as the realization settled in fully. He hadn't escaped, he hadn't gotten out, he had moved, that's all. From one place to another, from a house with one door, to a place with countless, and behind each door, something was knocking, waiting, listening, just like before, only now, there was no outside left to run to. You don't leave, the thing said, now standing beside him. The voice didn't arrive, it was simply there, no movement, no approach, no transition between distance and presence. One moment, Arjun was alone in a void of doors and endless knocking. The next, he wasn't. You move. Arjun flinched violently, stumbling to the side, his eyes snapping toward where the voice came from. And there it stood, right beside him, closer than before, closer than it had ever been. Its form was clearer here, no longer partially hidden by darkness or distance. Every detail of it existed with uncomfortable precision, the stretched limbs, the unnatural proportions, the stillness that didn't belong to anything alive, and its face, still his, still smiling, but now it felt more natural to it, as if the longer it wore his expression, the better it understood how to hold it. Arjun's voice trembled as he tried to speak, the words catching in his throat before forcing their way out. What? What is this place? His question echoed faintly, not in the air, but somewhere deeper, as if the space itself absorbed it and returned it slightly altered. The thing didn't look at him immediately. Its head tilted slightly, its gaze drifting toward the endless stretch of doors instead, as if considering how to answer. This is where you go when you answer. The words landed slowly, deliberately. Arjun shook his head, his fears sharpening into something more desperate now, more resistant. I didn't answer, he said, louder this time, as if volume alone could reshape what had already happened. The thing turned to him then. You did. Two simple words, final, unquestionable. The thing leaned closer, not stepping, not shifting, just closing the distance. Its presence pressed against him, not physically, but in a way that made it harder to breathe, harder to think, harder to exist as something separate. You acknowledged me. The phrase repeated in his mind instantly, overlapping with memory. The whisper, go away, so small, so insignificant, so easy to dismiss, and yet, enough. A knock echoed, single, sharp, from somewhere among the countless doors. Arjun's head snapped toward the sound instinctively, his body reacting before his mind could process it. Then another knock. Knock. Knock, from a different direction, then another, and another. The pattern spread rapidly, multiplying, overlapping, building into something overwhelming. Knock. 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 Hundreds of doors, hundreds of knocks, all at once. The rhythm consumed the space, echoing in layers, repeating endlessly, forming something that felt less like sound and more like a system, a process, a cycle. Arjun covered his ears again, but it didn't matter. It was inside him now, resonating through him, matching his heartbeat, matching his breath. You'll learn, the thing whispered, its voice cut through the noise without effort, calm and steady, as if the chaos around them didn't affect it at all, just like I did. Arjun's stomach dropped. The words didn't just register, they settled, deep, unavoidable. What? He asked, the single word barely forming. Fragile under the weight of everything pressing in around him, the thing turned its head slightly, the smile stretching wider, not suddenly, not unnaturally, but gradually, as if it had discovered something about the expression it enjoyed, something it preferred. I wasn't always this. The sentence lingered, longer than it should have, long enough for Arjun's mind to begin connecting pieces he hadn't wanted to consider: the voice, the mimicry, the patience, the way it learned, the way it waited, the way it understood. His breathing grew shallow, uneven. You mean? He started, the thought forming slowly, painfully, each piece falling into place with terrifying clarity. But he didn't finish. He didn't need to, because the thing understood. It always understood, before he spoke, before he finished thinking, before he accepted it. Its smile softened slightly, not into kindness, not into anything human, but into something closer to recognition, something almost familiar. You think I came from here? It asked quietly. The knocking around them continued, relentless, layered, endless. Knock. Knock. Knock, every door, every direction, every possibility. The thing leaned in closer still, its face inches from his now, its voice lowering just enough to feel like a secret being shared. I was where you are. Arjun's chest tightened violently. I heard the knock. The words hit harder than anything else, because now it wasn't just explaining, it was remembering. I ignored it. The thing continued, its tone unchanged, its expression steady. The knocking grew louder, closer, more immediate. I resisted. A pause, small, insignificant, but heavy, until I didn't. The smile returned to its full shape, stretched and perfect and empty, and then it said softly, its voice slipping fully into his own again, matching him in a way that felt final. Complete, irreversible, I learned. The knocking surged, every door, every direction, every possibility collapsing into a single, undeniable truth. This wasn't a place you escaped, this wasn't something you fought, this wasn't an entity you defeated. It was a cycle, a pattern, a transfer, and Arjun wasn't being chased, he wasn't being hunted, he was being replaced. Back in the real world, Arjun's house stood exactly as it had before, silent. Still, unchanged, the walls held their quiet. The narrow windows let in just enough moonlight to outline the familiar shapes of furniture and shadow. The long corridor stretched from one end to the other, empty. Undisturbed, as if nothing had ever moved through it, no signs of struggle, no signs of departure, no signs that anything had ever been wrong. The front door remained closed, locked, just as Arjun had left it. Time passed the way it always did in that place, slowly, quietly, unnoticed, until 3 a.m. exactly. Knock. 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 3 slow, deliberate taps, measured, intentional. The sound carried through the house, brushing against walls, slipping beneath doors, settling into the spaces between silence. It didn't echo, it lingered. Inside the house, something stirred, not abruptly, not with confusion or alarm, but with recognition. A presence that had been still became aware, a form that had been waiting shifted, slowly aligning itself with something it understood completely. It moved through the hallway without sound. Not walking, not stepping, just arriving. The air didn't react to it. The floor didn't creak beneath it. The shadows didn't shift to accommodate it, because it belonged there now. It reached the front door, paused, on the other side. Nothing visible, nothing human, just the absence of everything that should have been there, and the certainty of something that was. The knocking didn't repeat immediately. It waited, the same way it always had, patient, unrushed, certain. Inside, the figure tilted its head slightly, listening, not to the sound, but to what came with it, the rhythm, the intent, the recognition. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand. The movement was precise, controlled, practiced. Its Fingers hovered just above the surface of the door, lingering for a fraction longer than necessary, as if savoring the moment, as if remembering. Then, a smile spread across its face, too wide, too still, too familiar. Arjun's face, perfectly replicated, completely empty. And then, it knocked. Knock. 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 3 slow, deliberate taps, matching the rhythm exactly, not as a response, but as a continuation, because the pattern didn't end, it never ended, it only moved, from one side of the door, to the other. So if you ever hear it, at exactly 3 a.m., 3 slow knocks, perfectly spaced, measured, waiting, do nothing, don't speak, don't move. Don't even let your breath change, because it isn't just listening for sound, it's listening for you. The smallest response is enough, a whisper, a sigh, a single word you think doesn't matter, that's all it needs, because the moment you respond, you don't open the door, you become the door, and once that happens, it doesn't need to come inside, it already is. Your voice won't be yours anymore, your thoughts won't stay your own, and somewhere, far beyond the reach of anything real, in a place where silence is filled with endless waiting, you'll understand what it means to stand on the other side, surrounded by doors, countless, identical, each one holding a version of someone who thought they were safe. Each one waiting, listening, learning, just like you did, and when the time comes, when the pattern completes itself, when another voice slips, just once, and answers back, you won't hesitate, you won't question, you won't remember who you used to be, you'll raise your hand, you'll find the rhythm, and you'll knock, knock. 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 3 slow, deliberate taps, not asking to come in, not trying to get out, but making sure someone hears you. Story 2. Winchester Mystery House, the dark secret behind the legend. There's a house in California, standing quiet beneath the sun by day, but by night it feels like something else entirely, a place where logic unravels and silence feels watched. A house with staircases that rise only to stop mid-air, as if whoever built them forgot where they were meant to go. Or chose not to. Doors that open not into rooms, but into solid walls, into darkness, into nothing. Windows embedded into the floors, catching no light, reflecting no sky, only the unsettling feeling that they were never meant for the living to look through. A house that was never meant to make sense, not to architects, not to visitors, not even to time itself. But here's the part people don't talk about, the part buried beneath the stories. Beneath the tours, beneath the carefully rehearsed history. The house was never built to confuse the living. It was built to trap the dead, to mislead them, to corner them, to keep them wandering endlessly through a maze that has no center and no escape. And the woman who built it, the woman who poured her fortune, her grief, and her sanity into its endless construction, wasn't building a home. She was running. Running from something she could not see, but could feel in every empty hallway, every creaking step, every whisper that came when the house fell silent. She was trying to outrun something that never stopped following her. Something that didn't need doors to enter. Something that had already found its way inside. This is the story of the Winchester Mystery House, before the house. Before the endless corridors and impossible staircases. There was tragedy, quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, like a shadow stretching slowly across a sunlit room. Sarah Winchester was not always the woman history remembers, the grieving widow lost in a maze of her own making. Once, she was simply Sarah Pardee, a woman of intelligence and grace, raised in a world of culture and refinement, fluent in languages, deeply curious about the world, and full of a life that had not yet begun to fracture. She married William Wirt Winchester, the heir to the powerful Winchester Repeating Arms Company, a name that echoed across a rapidly changing America, carried on the back of a weapon that would redefine survival, conquest, and death itself, the Winchester rifle, often called the gun that won the West. It was a phrase spoken with pride by some, but behind it lay a quieter truth, one soaked into the soil of battlefields and frontier towns, a truth measured not in victories, but in lives lost, in stories ended abruptly, in families that would never be whole again. And though Sarah lived far from the smoke and chaos where those rifles were fired, the consequences of that legacy would find their way to her, slowly, patiently, as if carried on an unseen wind. Her life did not shatter all at once, it unraveled thread by thread. First came the loss of her infant daughter, Annie, taken by a rare and cruel illness that no doctor could explain and no prayer could prevent, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the very walls of her home. The nursery that once held laughter became a hollow space filled only with memory, and something else. Something heavier. Something that lingered. Years passed, but the grief never truly left, it only settled, waiting. Then, just when life began to resemble something stable again, it struck once more. William fell ill. Tuberculosis. A slow, wasting disease that drained him day by day, breath by breath, until the man she had built her life around was reduced to a fading presence, and then nothing at all. Gone, just like that, leaving behind not just a widow, but a void that seemed impossible to fill. And suddenly, Sarah was alone, truly alone, in a way that wealth could not soften and time could not heal. She inherited a massive fortune, one of the greatest of her time, but money has a way of amplifying emptiness when there is no one left to share it with. The grand rooms of her life grew quieter, the air heavier, every corner echoing with absence. What remained was not just grief, but an unbearable silence, the kind that presses in on you, that sits beside you in the dark, that refuses to let you forget what has been taken. But grief wasn't the only thing that followed her into that silence, and it wasn't the most terrifying. Because slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the silence began to change. It began to feel occupied. What was once empty no longer felt empty at all. There were moments when she would pause, certain she had heard something, a faint sound where none should exist, a presence just beyond her sight. The stillness grew restless, heavy with something unseen, something that did not belong to the world she understood. And then, one night, as she sat alone in the quiet that had become her prison, she realized something that would change everything. The silence was no longer silent. It was listening. And worse, it was beginning to whisper back. Desperate for answers and exhausted by a silence that no longer felt empty, Sarah Winchester turned to something she had once dismissed as superstition, something she would have once considered beneath her reason and education, a medium, a man who claimed he could speak to those who no longer belonged to the world of the living. It was not belief that led her there, but fear, the quiet, persistent kind that grows in the dark corners of the mind when grief has nowhere left to go. The séance began almost unremarkably, in a dimly lit room where candles flickered against the walls, their shadows stretching and twisting as if alive, the air thick with an unnatural stillness that seemed to press down on everything, suffocating even the smallest sound. At first, nothing happened. Just the low murmur of the medium's voice, steady and controlled, guiding the ritual forward. But then, slowly, something shifted. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air growing heavier, harder to breathe, as though something unseen had entered and taken up space among them. The candles trembled without wind, their flames bending in unnatural directions, and the medium's voice, changed. It deepened, hollowed out, as if echoing from somewhere far beyond the walls of that room, no longer entirely his own but something colder, something distant, something that did not belong to the living. When he spoke again, it was not to comfort her. It was not to soothe her grief. It was to deliver a message that would reshape the rest of her life, a message that would take her sorrow and twist it into something far more consuming. He told her she was cursed, not by fate, not by coincidence, but by something far more deliberate and far more relentless. He spoke of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company and the legacy it had built, not just in wealth, but in death, in the countless lives ended by the rifles that bore her family's name. Thousands, perhaps more, each bullet fired carrying with it not just destruction, but consequence, each life taken leaving behind something unfinished, something that refused to rest. These were not distant tragedies, he said. They were not forgotten. They had endured, and now they were aware. Every soul lost, every story cut short, every voice silenced, they were coming for her, drawn not by chance but by connection, bound to her through the fortune she carried and the name she could not escape. And there was only one way to survive what was coming. The instructions were as strange as they were terrifying: build a house, not just any house, but one that would never be complete, one that would grow and change endlessly, a structure without logic or pattern, a place that would confuse and contain the spirits that sought her. She was told to build constantly, without pause, without rest, to ensure that the construction never ceased, because as long as the house was being built, as long as the sound of hammer and nail echoed through its halls, she would remain beyond their reach. But if she ever stopped, if even for a moment the building came to an end, they would find her. They would reach her. And there would be no escape. It was a warning that most would have dismissed, written off as the manipulations of a charlatan or the imaginings of a grieving mind. But Sarah did not dismiss it, because somewhere deep within her, beneath the fear and the doubt, there was a recognition that she could not ignore. The things she had felt in the silence, the presence she could never quite see but could always sense, the moments when the air seemed to shift around her as if something unseen had drawn closer, they all aligned with what she was being told. This was not new. This was not sudden. It was something that had already begun. And as she sat there, listening to a voice that was no longer entirely human, she realized something that chilled her more deeply than anything else the medium had said. She was not being warned about what might come. She was being told about what had already found her. Because deep down, in a place she could no longer deny, she already knew the truth. Something was watching her, something patient, something that had followed her through grief and silence and loss, something that had been waiting for her to finally understand. And now that she did, it was no longer hiding. In 1886, driven by a warning she could no longer ignore, Sarah Winchester began construction on what would become the most infamous house in America, a structure that would defy logic, reason, and every known rule of architecture, and from the moment it began, it never truly stopped. Workers were hired in rotating shifts, brought in from surrounding areas and paid generously to ensure they asked few questions and stayed committed to a task that seemed, at first, merely unusual, but would soon reveal itself to be something far more unsettling. Day and night blurred together as the constant sound of hammers striking nails echoed through the growing structure, a relentless rhythm that filled the air 24 hours a day. 7 days a week, continuing not for months, not for a year, but for decades. The house expanded endlessly, rising and spreading in ways that no blueprint could ever justify, as if it were less a building and more a living thing, growing without a clear purpose or destination. But it did not grow like a normal house, guided by design or practicality. It twisted unpredictably, turned sharply where it shouldn't, and expanded into spaces that served no clear function, creating a layout that seemed almost deliberately impossible to understand. Staircases would rise with intention only to end abruptly against a ceiling, forcing anyone who climbed them to stop short, disoriented and uneasy. While doors were installed that opened not into rooms, but into sheer drops or solid barriers, leading nowhere but into confusion. Hallways stretched out only to loop back into themselves, trapping anyone who wandered too far in a disorienting cycle, while rooms appeared in odd places, some too small to serve any purpose, others oddly shaped, as if built to accommodate something unseen rather than human occupants. Windows were placed where they could never serve their purpose, facing walls, embedded in floors, positioned in ways that allowed no light to pass through, creating the unsettling impression that they were never meant to look outward at all. It quickly became clear that this was not architecture in any conventional sense. It was something else entirely, something that resisted understanding, something that seemed to follow rules that no one could quite grasp. The house had become a maze, vast and intricate, but not one designed for people to navigate or explore. This was a maze with a different purpose, one rooted in fear and belief, constructed not for the living, but for something that could not be seen. Sarah believed that by creating confusion, by building endlessly shifting paths and dead ends, she could disorient the spirits she feared were pursuing her, trapping them within the house's ever-changing layout, forcing them to wander without direction, unable to reach her as long as the construction continued. Each new addition, each alteration, each inexplicable design choice was part of a larger attempt to outwit something that did not follow human rules. To stay one step ahead of forces she could neither fully understand nor escape. But as the years passed and the house grew more complex, more chaotic, and more impossible, a far more unsettling question began to emerge, one that lingered in the minds of those who observed its strange evolution and in the quiet spaces between its walls. What if the house was not confusing the spirits at all? What if the endless corridors and impossible structures were not a defense, but a response? What if the design was not born solely from Sarah's fear and desperation, but from something else entirely? Because the deeper one looked at the house, the more it began to feel less like a trap being set and more like instructions being followed, as if the structure itself was being shaped by a will beyond human understanding. And if that were true, then the most terrifying possibility was not that Sarah was trying to outsmart the spirits, but that the spirits had been guiding her all along, using her grief, her fear, and her belief to build something of their own design, something that was never meant to keep them out, but to let them in. At the shifting heart of the labyrinth, somewhere between rooms that had no purpose and hallways that seemed to lead back into themselves, there was said to be a room that did not officially exist, a space absent from plans, unmarked by design, and known only through whispers passed carefully between those who had spent too long inside the house, a hidden chamber that even today is spoken of with hesitation, as if naming it too clearly might draw attention from something that prefers to remain unseen. It was here, in this concealed space deep within the ever-changing structure of the Winchester Mystery House, that Sarah Winchester is believed to have carried out the rituals that defined the later years of her life. Every night, just before midnight, she would make her way through the maze she had created, moving through corridors that shifted in meaning as much as in shape, navigating the house as though she alone understood its logic, until she reached that hidden door. Once inside, she would lock it behind her, sealing herself away from the rest of the world, from the workers, from the noise of construction, and perhaps most importantly, from anything that might have been following her through the halls. The room itself was said to be small, almost suffocating in its closeness, its air thick with the scent of melted wax and something older, something harder to place, as though it had absorbed years of whispered conversations not meant for human ears. Candles would be arranged in precise, deliberate patterns, their placement never random, forming shapes that seemed to carry meaning known only to her, while strange symbols, whether drawn, carved, or imagined, marked the floor in ways that suggested repetition, ritual, and intent. When everything was prepared, she would begin, speaking softly at first, her voice barely rising above a murmur, words slipping into the darkness as if offered to something just beyond sight. But these were not the uncertain attempts of someone trying to reach the dead for comfort or closure. Over time, the nature of these nightly rituals seemed to change. This was no longer about seeking answers. It was about receiving them. The silence in that room was not empty, it was expectant, as though it held space for something to respond, something that did not need to speak in ways the living could fully understand. By morning, when Sarah emerged, the house would change again. Workers arriving for their shifts would find new instructions waiting for them, often delivered without explanation, often impossible to justify through any practical reasoning. They were told to add staircases where none were needed, to seal doors that had only just been built, to construct rooms within rooms, creating layers that served no visible purpose and only deepened the confusion of the structure. These directions were followed without question, not because they made sense, but because questioning them was neither encouraged nor rewarded. The pay was generous, enough to keep workers returning despite the growing unease that settled into the bones of those who spent too much time inside the house, and the rules were simple, spoken quietly but firmly among them: do your work, take your wages, and do not ask why. More importantly, do not stay after dark. Most obeyed, eager to leave the strange atmosphere behind them as the sun dipped below the horizon. But some, whether out of curiosity, stubbornness, or simple misfortune, remained longer than they should have. And those who did carried with them stories they rarely shared in full, stories of moments when the house seemed to change in ways that could not be explained by ongoing construction alone, of sounds that did not match the rhythm of hammers and tools, of spaces that felt occupied even when empty. They spoke of the weight of being watched, of the unsettling sense that the house was not merely being built, but was aware of those within it, responding in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. And though many of them eventually left, choosing distance over understanding, the things they experienced in those hours after dark did not leave them. Those memories lingered, sharp and unyielding, refusing to fade, as if the house, or whatever moved within it, had marked them in some quiet, lasting way. As the years passed and the construction of the Winchester Mystery House continued without pause, a quiet understanding settled among the workers who labored within its ever-expanding walls. The house felt different after dark. During the day, the constant noise of hammering, sawing, and movement masked much of what might otherwise have been noticed, but as night took over and the rhythm of work slowed or shifted, those who remained began to experience something far more unsettling than exhaustion. It started subtly, almost easy to dismiss at first, footsteps echoing faintly through empty hallways long after everyone else had moved on, the sound too deliberate to be mistaken for the natural settling of wood. Too paced to be random. At times, workers would stop what they were doing, certain that someone was approaching from behind, only to turn and find the corridor completely empty, stretching out into dim light with no sign of movement. Doors, carefully secured just moments earlier, would creak open or shut on their own, the hinges groaning softly as if moved by an unseen hand, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Then there were the whispers, low, indistinct, often just beyond the edge of hearing, voices that seemed to form in the spaces between sounds, close enough to be noticed but too distant to be understood, as though something was trying to speak but could not quite cross into clarity. One worker, shaken enough to abandon his shift entirely, later claimed that he had heard a voice clearly, unmistakably, right behind him as he worked alone in a narrow passageway. It had spoken in a calm, almost measured tone, close enough that he could feel the breath of it against his ear. "You shouldn't be here. When he turned, expecting to see another worker or perhaps Sarah herself, there was no one, only the corridor, silent and unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. Another worker reported something far more visual, something that lingered in his memory with unsettling clarity. He had been carrying materials down one of the longer hallways when he noticed a figure standing at the far end, perfectly still, partially obscured by shadow but undeniably present. It appeared to be a man, dressed in clothing that did not match the time, garments that seemed older, worn in a way that suggested a different era entirely. The figure did not move, did not speak, did not react, but there was something about the way it stood, facing him directly, that conveyed awareness. As though it had been waiting to be seen. The worker froze, caught between curiosity and fear, and in that single moment of hesitation, he blinked. When his vision cleared, the figure was gone, leaving behind nothing but an empty corridor and a lingering sense that he had not imagined what he had seen. Beyond these encounters, the house itself began to behave in ways that defied explanation. Tools that had been set down carefully would be found in entirely different locations, nails and materials would go missing without trace, only to reappear later in places no one remembered putting them. Entire sections of work, walls, fixtures, partial structures, would sometimes appear altered or undone overnight, as if someone had gone through the house reversing progress, dismantling what had been built with quiet precision. Workers would return to areas they had completed the previous day only to find them subtly different, changed in ways that could not be easily attributed to error or miscommunication. And then there were the more disturbing accounts, the ones shared only in hushed tones among those who had experienced them firsthand, stories of rooms that seemed to exist one day and vanish the next. Corridors that felt longer or shorter depending on when they were walked, spaces that did not behave consistently, as though the structure itself refused to remain fixed. It was as if the house was not merely being constructed but was in a constant state of quiet rearrangement, shifting in ways too subtle to witness directly but too significant to ignore. The most unsettling part was not the individual events, but the growing realization that these occurrences did not seem random. They followed no pattern that could be understood, but they also did not feel chaotic. Instead, they carried a sense of intention, as though something within the house was aware of the changes being made and was responding to them, adjusting, correcting, or perhaps even guiding the process. While Sarah Winchester remained at the center of the construction, issuing instructions that often made little sense, there were moments when even her involvement did not fully account for what was happening. Changes occurred without her direction, alterations appeared that no one remembered being ordered. And the house seemed to take on a presence of its own, one that extended beyond the influence of any single person. Among the workers, an unspoken conclusion began to take shape, one that few were willing to articulate openly but many could not entirely dismiss. Whatever was influencing the house, whatever moved through its corridors after dark and left behind whispers, footsteps, and impossible changes, it was not simply the result of human design or intention. It was something else, something that did not belong to the world they understood, something that did not need permission to enter or leave, something that had found its place within the walls and had no intention of leaving. In 1906, the ground beneath California convulsed with a force that no structure, no matter how vast or intricate, could fully withstand, and when the great earthquake struck, the Winchester Mystery House was not spared from its violence. The sprawling, ever-expanding mansion, already unstable in its strange and unconventional design, shuddered violently as the earth split and shifted beneath it, sending shockwaves through its endless corridors and fragile frameworks. Walls cracked open with sharp, splintering sounds, sections of the house collapsed inward on themselves, and entire rooms, some newly built, others long forgotten, were reduced to debris in a matter of moments. Staircases that had once led nowhere crumbled completely. Hallways buckled, and windows shattered, scattering glass across floors that had never been meant to bear such force. It was chaos, but not the kind that passed quickly. The tremors seemed to linger, each aftershock carrying with it the unsettling feeling that the house itself was resisting, straining against something far deeper than the movement of the earth. Somewhere within that collapsing labyrinth was Sarah Winchester, caught in the midst of destruction she could neither predict nor control. As the structure gave way around her, she became trapped, buried beneath fallen beams and broken walls, confined in darkness where the air grew thick with dust and silence returned in a form far more suffocating than before. Hours passed before she was found, hours in which she lay immobilized within the wreckage of the very house she had spent decades building, unable to move, unable to call out, surrounded by the stillness that followed the quake. When rescuers finally reached her and pulled her from the debris, shaken but alive, her response was not relief, nor was it gratitude. Instead, she is said to have spoken words that unsettled those around her, words that revealed how she understood what had just happened. She believed the destruction was not random, not merely the result of natural forces, but something deliberate. "This is their doing," she reportedly said, her voice carrying a certainty that left little room for doubt. To her, the earthquake was not just an event, it was a message. The spirits she feared, the unseen presence she believed had followed her for years, were not only aware of her efforts, they were responding to them. She became convinced that she had made a mistake, that somewhere within the endless construction, she had failed to follow the instructions she believed she was receiving, that the house she had built, this massive, confusing labyrinth, was not enough to contain or appease whatever forces surrounded her. And so, rather than simply rebuilding what had been lost, rather than restoring the house to its previous form, she made a decision that would alter the structure in a way that deepened its mystery even further. She ordered that certain sections of the house be sealed completely, not repaired, not reconstructed, but closed off entirely, as if they were no longer meant to exist. Doors were shut and locked, passageways blocked, entire areas abandoned and cut off from the rest of the house, left exactly as they had been in the aftermath of the quake. There was no attempt to salvage these spaces, no effort to return them to use. Instead, they were deliberately isolated, hidden behind walls and barriers, removed from the shifting maze that continued to grow around them. To those who worked on the house, this decision seemed as strange as everything else she had commanded, but it carried a different weight, a sense of finality that could not be ignored. It was as if those sealed sections contained something that was not meant to be disturbed again, something that could not simply be rebuilt over or erased. The choice to leave them untouched suggested more than caution, it suggested fear, the kind that comes not from uncertainty, but from belief. And within the context of everything that had come before, the whispers, the unexplained changes, the constant need to build, it raised a far more unsettling possibility. That the destruction caused by the earthquake had revealed something within the house that Sarah could not control, something that had been hidden beneath layers of construction and confusion, something that, once exposed, could not be allowed to remain accessible. The sealed rooms became silent spaces within an already silent labyrinth, places that existed but could no longer be reached, their contents left unknown. And in the years that followed, as construction continued around them, those hidden sections remained exactly as they had been left, untouched and unexamined, as if whatever lay inside them was better left forgotten, or perhaps, more accurately, contained. For nearly 40 years, the sound of construction never left the halls of the Winchester Mystery House, a constant, unbroken rhythm of hammer against nail, of wood being shaped and reshaped, of walls rising only to be altered again, as if the house itself refused to ever reach completion. Day blended into night, night into day, until time inside the mansion no longer felt linear, only measured by the persistence of work that never truly paused. The workers came and went, shifts rotated, faces changed, but the sound remained, echoing through corridors that seemed to stretch further with each passing year. At the center of it all was Sarah Winchester, moving through the labyrinth with quiet purpose, issuing instructions that kept the structure in a perpetual state of transformation, as though stopping, even for a moment, would invite something she could not afford to face. And then, one night in 1922, without warning, without ceremony, without the gradual slowing one might expect after decades of relentless activity, it all stopped. Sarah Winchester died in her sleep, alone within the very house she had spent her life constructing, her passing as quiet and sudden as the silence that followed it. There was no final instruction, no last addition to the maze, no clear indication that she had anticipated the end. One moment, the house was alive with sound, with movement, with purpose. The next, it was still. For the first time in decades, the tools were set down and not picked up again, the workers dismissed with no further orders, the endless cycle of building brought to an abrupt and irreversible halt. The silence that settled over the mansion was unlike anything it had known before, not the uneasy quiet of night between shifts, but a deep, consuming stillness that filled every hallway, every room, every hidden corner. No more hammering echoed through the walls, no footsteps marked the passage of time, no voices called out instructions or warnings. The house, once in constant motion, seemed to hold its breath, as if adjusting to a reality it had never been designed to endure. But that silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied. Those who entered the house in the days and weeks that followed would later speak of a strange heaviness in the air, a sense that the absence of sound had created space for something else to emerge. The familiar noises were gone, but in their place was something far less comforting, something that lingered just beneath perception. There were moments when the stillness felt too complete, too deliberate, as though it were not the result of abandonment, but of anticipation. Because the most unsettling part of it all was not that the construction had stopped, but what that might mean. For decades, the house had been in a state of constant change, its growth believed, by Sarah, at least, to be a form of protection, a way to delay or confuse whatever forces she feared were pursuing her. As long as the building continued, as long as the maze expanded and shifted, she believed she could remain just out of reach. But now, for the first time, that process had ended. The house was no longer growing. The paths were no longer changing. The structure, as impossible as it was, had become fixed. And if what she had been told all those years ago was true, if the constant construction had been the only thing keeping those unseen presences at bay, then the silence that followed her death was not just the absence of work. It was the removal of the only barrier that had ever existed. The house stood still, but whatever had been waiting did not need movement to find its way. And as the days passed and the stillness remained, one unsettling realization began to take shape among those who dared to consider it. The silence had not ended anything. It had only marked the beginning of something else. Because whatever had been held back for nearly 40 years was no longer being delayed. And in that heavy, watchful quiet, it began to feel as though the house was no longer waiting to be built. It was waiting to be entered. Today, the Winchester Mystery House still stands, preserved yet unsettled, a sprawling labyrinth of more than 160 rooms that continues to defy logic, its corridors twisting in ways that seem to resist being fully understood even now. To most, it is a historic attraction, a curiosity frozen in time where visitors walk through its halls guided by well-rehearsed stories, listening as tour guides explain its strange architecture with a mixture of fascination and intrigue. People move through its rooms with cameras in hand, capturing staircases that lead nowhere, doors that open into emptiness, windows placed where they should not exist, often laughing at the absurdity of it all, treating the house as a puzzle rather than a warning. In the daylight, it feels manageable, almost harmless, its mysteries softened by explanation and routine, its history packaged into something that can be observed and then left behind. But not everyone experiences it that way. Some linger a little longer, drawn not just by curiosity, but by a feeling they cannot quite explain, something subtle that begins as a discomfort and slowly sharpens into awareness. It starts with small things, easy to dismiss if one chooses to ignore them, a sudden drop in temperature in certain rooms where the air feels unnaturally cold compared to the rest of the house, as if something invisible has settled there and refuses to move. Doors, once closed, shift ever so slightly, not with the force of wind or the obvious push of a hand, but with a slow, deliberate motion that feels almost intentional, as though guided by something unseen. Footsteps echo faintly along the wooden floors, soft but distinct, following at a distance that never quite closes, always just behind, just out of sight, leaving those who hear them with the uneasy instinct to turn around, only to find no one there. These moments are brief, often brushed aside, explained away by creaking wood or imagination, but they leave behind a lingering sense that the house is not entirely still, not entirely empty. And then there are the experiences that happen when the house is no longer filled with voices. When the final tour has ended, when the lights have been dimmed and the doors closed, and the structure is left to itself in the quiet of the night. It is in those hours, when the outside world feels distant and the labyrinth is wrapped in darkness, that something else begins to emerge. Those who have remained nearby, whether staff, security, or the occasional witness who stayed longer than they should have, speak of a sound that does not belong to an empty building, a sound that is faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural settling of an old structure, but too consistent, too rhythmic to ignore. It comes from somewhere deep within the house, from corridors that twist beyond easy reach. From rooms that may or may not still exist in the same way they did during the day. A quiet, measured tapping begins to echo through the silence, soft, deliberate, repeating in a pattern that feels unmistakably familiar. Tap. 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 The sound is not loud, not aggressive, but persistent, carrying through the stillness with a clarity that suggests purpose. It is the sound of construction, of work being done, of something continuing long after it should have ended. And the most unsettling part is not just the presence of the sound, but what it implies. Because the house has not been under constant construction for over a century. The workers are gone, the tools long since set aside, the endless building brought to a stop with the death of Sarah Winchester. And yet, the sound remains, as if something within the structure has taken up the task, continuing where she left off, following instructions that were never meant to end. It suggests that the house was never truly finished, not because it was incomplete, but because it was never meant to be completed at all. That its purpose extended beyond the life of the person who built it, beyond the years of visible construction, into something quieter, something hidden within its walls. The idea that something could still be building, still shaping the interior of that impossible maze, raises a question that lingers long after the sound fades. What exactly is being finished? And more importantly, who, or what, is doing the building now? So if you ever find yourself walking through the Winchester Mystery House, moving through its quiet corridors where every turn feels just slightly unfamiliar, where the air carries a stillness that doesn't quite feel empty, and you come across a door that seems out of place, a door set into a wall where no room should exist, or positioned at the end of a hallway that feels too narrow, too deliberate, pause for a moment before you reach for it, because not every door in that house was built to be opened. Some were placed there for reasons that have nothing to do with passage or design, nothing to do with convenience or curiosity. You might notice the handle feels colder than it should, or that the wood beneath your fingers carries a weight, as if it has been holding something back for far longer than it was ever meant to. There may be no markings, no warnings, nothing to suggest that it is any different from the others you've already passed through, and that is what makes it dangerous, because the most important boundaries are rarely the ones that are clearly defined. You may tell yourself it's just another part of the maze, another architectural oddity in a house built on confusion, but deep down, there will be a moment, a brief, quiet hesitation, where something doesn't feel right, where instinct tells you to step back, to leave it alone, to let it remain exactly as it is. Listen to that feeling. Because some doors in that house were never meant to lead anywhere. They were never meant to be understood, explored, or explained. They were built for a purpose far more unsettling than curiosity can justify. They were meant to separate, to divide, to contain. And whatever lies on the other side may not be waiting to be discovered, but waiting to be released. The house has stood for over a century, holding its secrets in silence, its walls layered with choices made out of fear, belief, and something far harder to define. Every sealed space, every hidden corner, every impossible design may be part of something that was never truly finished, something that did not end when the construction stopped or when Sarah Winchester took her final breath. So if you ever find yourself standing in front of a door that leads nowhere, in a house that was never meant to make sense, remember this: some doors are not there to be opened. They are there to remain closed, to keep something exactly where it has always been. And the moment you decide to ignore that, may be the moment the house finally lets something out. Story 3. The Abandoned Asylum's Hidden Crying Room. There are places that don't just hold memories. They trap emotions, sealing them into the walls like something alive, something breathing just beneath the surface. Pain doesn't fade there. Fear doesn't loosen its grip. Grief doesn't move on. It lingers, it seeps into the air, into the silence, into every crack and corner until the place itself begins to feel heavy. Like it's watching, like it's listening. And sometimes, those emotions don't disappear with time. They don't weaken. They don't die. They change. They settle. They learn how to wait, quiet, patient, and aware. Tonight's story isn't about ghosts. Not in the way you might expect. There are no shadows moving in the dark, no sudden figures in broken mirrors. No, this is about something far worse. Something that doesn't need to appear to be felt. Something that doesn't haunt you, but stays with you. Hidden deep inside an abandoned asylum, beyond rusted doors and forgotten corridors, there exists a room that was never meant to be found. A room that was sealed away not because it was empty, but because it wasn't. Because what it held could not be controlled, could not be erased, could not be understood. A room where the walls don't just echo cries. They remember them, replay them, reshape them. Until eventually, they start to sound like you. On the outskirts of a forgotten town, where the road thinned into cracked earth and the streetlights stopped pretending to work, stood the ruins of Ross Island Mental Asylum, a structure so still, so unnaturally quiet, it felt less like a building and more like something that had been deliberately left behind by time itself. It didn't appear on maps. It wasn't marked on any official records. There were no government files, no archived blueprints, no trace of its existence in any public system, as if someone had gone to great lengths not just to shut it down, but to erase the very idea that it had ever stood there at all. And yet, despite the absence of documentation, despite the complete lack of formal acknowledgement, the locals knew about it. They had always known. They just never spoke about it, not openly, not willingly, and never after sunset. If you brought it up casually, the conversation would shift. If you insisted, voices would lower, eyes would drift away, and an uncomfortable silence would take hold, as though even mentioning the place invited something unseen to listen in. The older villagers reacted differently. They didn't deflect. They didn't deny. They simply refused to engage. Their expressions hardened, their bodies stilled, and their gaze, if it met yours at all, carried a quiet warning that didn't need words to be understood. But if you pressed them, if you pushed past that fragile boundary of unspoken rules, they would eventually give you something. Not answers. Not explanations. Just a single sentence, spoken with a weight that lingered long after the words had faded. Some places are abandoned for a reason. No one ever elaborated on what that reason was, and no one dared to ask twice. According to what little fragmented information could be gathered from whispered conversations and fading personal accounts, the asylum had been shut down abruptly sometime in the late 1980s. There were no official closure notices, no relocation plans for the patients, no documented transfers to other facilities. Families who had once sent their loved ones there never received updates, never got discharge papers, never even received confirmation of what had happened inside those walls. It was as if, overnight, the entire institution had simply ceased to exist, not just in operation, but in memory, in record. In truth, the gates had been locked, the road leading to it left to decay, and over time, nature began to reclaim what remained, vines creeping over broken windows, roots pushing through cracked floors, silence settling into every corridor like a permanent resident. But it wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful. It wasn't the quiet of abandonment or the stillness of something long forgotten. It was heavier than that. Denser. A silence that pressed against your ears, that made your own breathing sound too loud, your own presence feel intrusive. Because silence, in places like this, is never truly empty. It doesn't mean the absence of sound. It means the absence of escape. Rohan wasn't the kind of person who believed in hauntings, not because he had never heard the stories, but because he had spent years dismantling them, reducing whispers of the supernatural into patterns, explanations, and human error. As a documentary filmmaker, he had built his reputation on exploring abandoned places, factories left to rust, villages swallowed by time, hospitals where paint peeled like dead skin from the walls, always searching for the stories that had been left behind rather than the myths that tried to replace them. He was drawn to decay, not out of morbid fascination, but because he believed that forgotten places told the most honest truths. To him, fear wasn't something mystical or unexplainable. It was simply unexplored history, waiting to be uncovered, understood, and translated into something tangible. Every creak had a cause. Every shadow had a source. Every story, no matter how terrifying, had a beginning rooted in reality. That belief had never failed him. Not once. Until Ross Island Asylum. The first time he heard about the asylum, it wasn't through any official source or online thread, but through a passing mention in a half-forgotten forum, buried deep within discussions about inaccessible locations. What caught his attention wasn't the mention itself, but the absence surrounding it. There were no photographs. No shaky nighttime videos recorded by thrill seekers. No blog posts detailing break-ins or explorations. No coordinates. No guides. Nothing. In an age where even the most remote ruins were documented and dissected, Ross Island Asylum existed in a kind of digital void, untouched, unsearched, almost as if the internet itself refused to acknowledge it. That should have been enough to make him walk away, or at the very least, question why a place so supposedly real had left no trace behind. But for Rohan, that absence didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a challenge. A gap waiting to be filled. A story waiting to be told. What others might have interpreted as a warning, he saw as an invitation, something hidden not because it was dangerous, but because it had simply been overlooked. And Rohan had always been drawn to what others overlooked. He spent weeks tracking down fragmented directions, piecing together vague descriptions from locals who spoke reluctantly and only in fragments, following roads that seemed to lead nowhere until, eventually, they did. By the time he finally arrived, the sun was already beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the uneven ground, as if stretching the world itself into something unfamiliar. The air felt different the moment he stepped out of his vehicle, still. Unnaturally so, as though even the wind avoided this place. Ahead of him, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation and time's neglect, stood the asylum. It didn't rise into view so much as it revealed itself slowly, its outline emerging from the landscape like something that had been waiting to be noticed. The building loomed like a corpse that refused to collapse, its structure intact but lifeless, its surface marked by years of abandonment. The walls were peeling in long, curling strips, exposing the layers beneath like old wounds. Windows hung shattered or missing entirely, their empty frames staring outward like hollow eyes. The main gate, once imposing, now sagged under its own rusted weight. One side barely clinging to its hinges, swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. Everything about the place suggested neglect, decay, and the natural passage of time. And yet, standing there, taking it all in through the lens of his camera, Rohan felt something that didn't fit into any of those categories. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was subtler than that. A quiet, persistent discomfort that settled somewhere deep in his chest, refusing to be ignored. The building didn't feel empty. It didn't carry the hollow stillness he had grown accustomed to in other abandoned sites. Instead, it felt occupied. Not in a physical sense, not in a way he could capture or define, but in a way that made the silence seem deliberate rather than natural. As if the absence of sound wasn't because there was nothing left to make it, but because something had chosen not to. As the last light of day began to fade behind him, Rohan adjusted his grip on the camera and took a step forward, crossing the threshold of rusted iron and overgrown weeds. The moment he did, the feeling intensified, subtle but undeniable, like stepping into a space that was already aware of his presence. He paused for just a second, glancing up at the darkened windows, half expecting to see movement, to catch something shifting just out of sight. There was nothing there. Nothing visible. Nothing that could be explained or recorded. And yet, as he moved closer, as the shadows deepened and the building seemed to grow larger with each step, one thought lingered at the edge of his mind, quiet but persistent, refusing to fully form yet impossible to dismiss. It didn't feel like he was discovering the place. It felt like the place had been waiting for him to arrive. Inside, the air felt wrong in a way Rohan couldn't immediately explain, not thick with dust or decay as he had expected, not carrying the usual stale scent of abandonment, but something heavier, something that seemed to settle on his skin and press inward as though the building itself had weight beyond its structure. Each breath felt just slightly more deliberate, as if the air resisted being taken in, as if it had been undisturbed for far too long and resented the intrusion. The moment he stepped fully inside, the outside world seemed to fall away completely, the distant sounds of wind, insects, and rustling leaves cutting off so abruptly it felt unnatural, leaving behind a silence that wasn't peaceful but tense. Stretched thin like something waiting to snap. His footsteps broke that silence, but even that felt wrong. They echoed, yes, but not in the familiar way of empty spaces where sound travels freely. These echoes were sharper, louder than they should have been, each step returning to him with a clarity that made it feel like the building was amplifying his presence rather than simply reflecting it, as though every movement he made was being announced, acknowledged, recorded. It gave him the uneasy impression that he wasn't just walking through the asylum, but that the asylum was, in some quiet, unseen way, reacting to him. He moved slowly, camera raised, the lens capturing peeling walls, rusted fixtures, and corridors that seemed to stretch further than they should, his trained eye cataloging details, searching for anything unusual, anything that might explain the stories he had heard. At first, there was nothing, just the expected signs of abandonment, the quiet decay of a place long left behind. Then he heard it. It was so faint that he almost dismissed it immediately, a soft, distant sound that barely rose above the silence, subtle enough to be mistaken for the shifting of old pipes or the whisper of air moving through broken structures. He paused mid-step, holding his breath without realizing it, his ears straining to catch it again, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his own movement and the dull thud of his heartbeat. For a moment, he convinced himself it had been nothing, just his mind filling the silence, creating patterns where none existed, a common response in environments like this. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the camera, ready to move on. Then it came again. This time it lingered just a fraction longer, long enough for him to recognize it not as a mechanical noise or a trick of acoustics, but as something distinctly human. A muffled sob, restrained, as if whoever, or whatever, was making it was trying not to be heard. The sound carried a texture to it, a fragile, trembling quality that no broken pipe or shifting beam could replicate. Rohan's body reacted before his mind could fully process it. His shoulders stiffened, his posture straightened, and a small, involuntary tension settled in his chest. He turned his head slightly, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the sound didn't behave the way it should have. It didn't bounce off walls or travel through the corridor in a clear line. It seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once, as though it wasn't moving through the space but existing within it. He let out a quiet breath, forcing a small smile to steady himself, the rational part of his mind stepping in to reassert control. Animals, he muttered under his breath, the word sounding less certain once it left his mouth. Or pipes. It was a familiar reflex, labeling the unknown to make it manageable, reducing the unsettling into something explainable. He had done it countless times before, and it had always been enough. But this time, the explanation felt thin, fragile, like something that could collapse under the slightest pressure. Because deep down, beneath the surface of logic and habit, something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the sound itself, but the way it behaved. The way it interacted with the space around it. In every other place he had explored, sound had followed rules, simple, predictable patterns of movement and reflection. It echoed. It faded. It carried. This didn't. This sound didn't echo at all. It didn't bounce or distort or diminish. Instead, it seemed to sink into the environment, to be absorbed by it, as though the walls weren't reflecting the noise but taking it in, holding on to it, preventing it from escaping. The silence that followed each faint sob didn't feel like an absence of sound, but like something had swallowed it whole, leaving behind a hollow, unnatural stillness. Rohan stood there for a moment longer, listening. Waiting, his senses heightened in a way he couldn't quite control. The rational explanations were still there, still present, but they no longer felt solid. They felt like placeholders, temporary structures built to keep something else at bay. And as he took another slow step forward, deeper into the corridor, the thought crept in quietly, almost reluctantly, forming at the edge of his awareness before he could fully stop it. Whatever he had just heard, it didn't sound like it belonged to the building. It sounded like it belonged to something the building was trying to keep contained. As Rohan moved deeper into the asylum, the unease that had been quietly building since he entered began to take on a more defined shape, no longer just a vague discomfort but something sharper, more deliberate, as if the space itself was slowly revealing that it didn't follow the same rules as the world outside. At first, it was subtle, small inconsistencies he might have otherwise ignored, but the longer he walked, the harder they became to dismiss. The layout didn't make sense. Corridors stretched ahead and then curved in ways that felt unnatural, bending just enough to disrupt his sense of direction without being obvious about it, as though the architecture had been designed to confuse rather than guide. He passed door after door, each one leading into rooms that looked nearly identical, same dimensions, same cracked walls, same scattered remnants of what might have once been furniture, but there was something off about them, a faint sense of repetition that went beyond coincidence. He entered one room, scanned it quickly, and stepped back into the corridor, only to realize that the hallway outside looked exactly the same as the one he had just left, down to the pattern of peeling paint and the placement of debris. He paused, turning slowly, trying to trace his steps, but the path behind him didn't feel certain anymore. It was as if the building had quietly rearranged itself in the seconds he wasn't looking. He told himself it was disorientation, a common effect in large, abandoned structures where everything begins to blur together, but the explanation felt insufficient, too convenient. Because this didn't feel like getting lost. It felt like being kept. The further he went, the more that sensation grew, subtle but persistent, like an invisible pressure guiding him forward while quietly erasing any sense of where he had come from. And then he saw them. At first, it was just a mark on the wall, something his eyes caught in passing, a deep scratch carved into the faded surface, too deliberate to be accidental. He slowed, stepping closer, the beam of his camera light tracing the line, revealing its depth, its rough edges, the way it cut through layers of paint and plaster as if whoever had made it hadn't cared about damaging the wall, only about leaving something behind. Then he noticed there were more. Not just one or two, but dozens, scattered across the surface in clusters, overlapping in places, repeating in others. He raised the camera slightly, focusing on the shapes, and the moment recognition set in, the air seemed to grow even heavier. They weren't random marks. They were words. Carved, not written. Forced into the wall with something sharp enough to break through the surface, deep enough to last. Stop the sound. The letters were uneven, jagged, as if carved in haste or desperation, each line pressed harder than necessary, the grooves cutting deep into the plaster. Just below it, another set. Make it quiet. This one was neater, but no less urgent, the strokes more controlled but still carrying a tension that suggested whoever had written it had been trying to hold themselves together while doing so. And then, scattered around them, layered over older marks and partially hidden beneath newer ones, a single word repeated again and again. Please. Different sizes. Different styles. Some barely legible, others carved so deeply they had cracked the wall around them. Each one distinct, each one separate, yet all carrying the same weight, the same desperate need to be heard. Rohan's gaze moved slowly across the wall, taking in the variations, the differences in pressure, in spacing, in form. These hadn't been made by one person. They had been made by many. Different hands. Different moments. Different levels of desperation. And yet, despite those differences, they all said the same thing. The realization settled in quietly but heavily, sinking into his thoughts in a way he couldn't immediately shake. This wasn't random damage. It wasn't mindless vandalism. It was a pattern. A message repeated over time, by people who had experienced something so overwhelming, so unbearable, that they had felt the need to leave it behind, to warn, to plead, to beg for something to stop. The air around him felt tighter now, the silence no longer just heavy but strained, as though it was holding something back. And then the crying sound returned. It didn't creep in gradually this time. It was simply there, present and unmistakable, filling the space in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It was closer now, much closer than before, the softness replaced by a clearer, more defined edge that carried a raw, unfiltered emotion. The sobs were uneven, broken, layered with a kind of exhaustion that suggested they had been going on for far longer than they should have. Rohan's body reacted instantly, a chill running through him as the sound wrapped around the corridor. Not traveling from a specific direction but existing within the space itself, as though the walls were producing it rather than reflecting it. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the hallway, searching for a source, for movement, for anything that might ground the sound in reality. There was nothing. No visible presence. No shifting shadows. Just the empty corridor and the carved words staring back at him. The crying didn't fade this time. It didn't stop and start like before. It continued, steady and unbroken, filling every corner of the space, pressing into his ears, into his thoughts, into the quiet spaces between his breaths. And as it continued, as it refused to fade or weaken, a new understanding began to form, slow and unwelcome, rising from somewhere deep in his mind. The people who had carved those words into the walls hadn't been reacting to a moment. They had been reacting to something constant. Something that didn't stop. At the end of a narrow corridor that seemed tighter than the rest, as though the walls had slowly leaned inward over time, Rohan found it, a door that immediately set itself apart from everything else he had seen so far, not because it was grand or intact, but because it carried a sense of intention, of purpose, as if it had been designed not just to exist within the building but to contain something the rest of the asylum could not. The corridor leading to it felt subtly different, the air heavier, more concentrated, each step forward accompanied by a growing pressure that he couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore either, as though the space itself was narrowing not just physically, but perceptually, drawing his focus toward the door whether he wanted it to or not. Unlike the other doors he had passed, most of them decayed, broken, or hanging uselessly from rusted hinges, this one remained firmly in place, its structure reinforced with a metal lining that had dulled with age but not weakened, the edges bolted and sealed in a way that suggested it had once been meant to withstand force from within rather than from outside. Several heavy locks had been fixed along its frame, layered one over the other in a way that felt excessive, almost desperate, as though whoever had installed them hadn't trusted a single barrier to be enough. But what caught his attention more than the locks themselves was their condition. Every single one of them had been broken, not from the inside, as he might have expected if something had tried to force its way out, but from the outside, the metal bent and snapped outward, the damage clearly inflicted by someone trying to get in, not keep something contained. That detail settled uneasily in his mind, lingering just long enough to make him pause before stepping closer. Then he saw the carving. It wasn't like the scratches he had seen earlier on the walls, not the frantic, uneven marks left behind by multiple hands in varying states of panic. This was different. The words had been carved with deliberate force, deep enough to splinter the wood beneath the surface, each letter cut clean and heavy, as though whoever had written it had taken their time, pressing each stroke in with enough strength to ensure it would never fade, never be ignored. Do not open during crying. The message stood out starkly against the worn surface, its clarity unsettling in a way the chaotic wall carvings hadn't been. This wasn't a plea. It wasn't fragmented or desperate. It was a warning. Direct. Specific. Conditional. Rohan let out a short, nervous laugh, the sound feeling strangely out of place in the confined space, as though it didn't belong there. Who writes this stuff? He muttered, the words meant to ground him, to push back against the creeping tension that had begun to settle deeper into his chest. But even as he said it, even as he tried to dismiss it as nothing more than the remnants of a disturbed past, the environment around him began to shift in a way he could no longer rationalize. The crying, which had been present in the background, constant but distant, began to change. It didn't grow louder in the way sound typically does, not in volume or intensity that could be measured. Instead, it grew closer in a way that felt internal rather than external, as though the source of it had moved from somewhere within the building to somewhere within him. The sobbing pressed against his awareness, wrapping around his thoughts, threading itself through the quiet spaces in his mind until it felt less like something he was hearing and more like something he was experiencing. It was no longer just sound. It was presence. It was weight. It was something that occupied the same space as his own consciousness, overlapping with it in a way that made it difficult to separate where it ended and he began. His breathing slowed, not by choice but by instinct, his body reacting to something it couldn't fully understand. The corridor felt smaller now, tighter, as though the walls had inched closer without him noticing. The air seemed to press in from all sides, carrying the sound with it, amplifying the sensation that it wasn't coming from anywhere around him but from somewhere far more intimate. Drawn by something he couldn't name, he stepped closer to the door, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if part of him recognized the weight of the moment even if his mind refused to fully acknowledge it. He reached out, his hand hovering for just a second before making contact with the surface. The wood felt colder than it should have, the chill seeping into his skin instantly, grounding him in the physical sensation even as everything else around him felt increasingly unreal. And then, the moment his hand rested fully against the door, the crying stopped. Not gradually. Not fading or diminishing the way sound naturally does. It ended completely, as if it had been cut off mid-breath, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt unnatural. The sudden absence was more jarring than the sound had been, the space around him collapsing into a stillness that carried its own kind of pressure, heavier in its emptiness than the crying had been in its presence. Rohan didn't move. He stood there. His hand still pressed against the door, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The silence wasn't comforting. It didn't bring relief. If anything, it felt wrong, like a system that had been abruptly shut down without warning, leaving behind something unresolved, something unfinished. This should have been the moment he stepped back. The moment he recognized that whatever was happening here didn't fit into the patterns he understood, didn't follow the logic he relied on. This should have been the moment he turned around, retraced his steps, if that was even still possible, and left the building behind. Every instinct, every subtle warning his body had been sending since he entered the asylum, pointed toward that single decision. But Rohan had built his entire life on moving toward the unknown, not away from it. He had spent years chasing unanswered questions, stepping into places others avoided, driven by the need to understand what lay beneath the surface. And now, standing in front of a door that clearly wasn't meant to be opened, in a place that had already begun to defy his expectations, that instinct didn't fade. It sharpened. The silence pressed in around him, waiting, heavy and absolute, and in that moment, instead of stepping back, instead of listening to the quiet warning embedded in the stillness, Rohan made a choice. He stayed. The door didn't open easily, it resisted at first, as though the weight behind it wasn't just physical but intentional, the hinges groaning in a long, strained creak that echoed down the narrow corridor before finally giving way, inch by reluctant inch, until the gap widened enough for darkness to spill out from within. Rohan hesitated for the briefest moment, his hand still pressed against the cold surface, his instincts pulling in two directions at once, one urging caution, the other urging curiosity, but as always, curiosity won. He pushed the door further and stepped inside. What he saw didn't match what he had expected, and that was what unsettled him the most. There was nothing. No scattered furniture, no rusted medical equipment, no restraints hanging from walls or ceiling, nothing that visually justified the reinforced door or the warning carved into it. The room was small, square, and almost unnaturally bare, its emptiness more deliberate than abandoned, as though everything that had once been there had been removed with purpose rather than lost to time. The walls were padded, but not in the way one might expect from a medical facility designed for safety. This padding was uneven, its surface rough and worn, sections torn open to reveal layers beneath, each layer slightly different in color and texture, suggesting that they had been replaced repeatedly over the years. The fabric was stained in places, not with a single pattern but with overlapping marks that had darkened and faded at different intervals, as if the room had absorbed something over time that couldn't be fully cleaned or erased. The padding itself seemed to sag in certain areas, bulging slightly as though whatever lay beneath it had shifted or settled in ways it wasn't meant to. There was a sense of accumulation to it, not just of material, but of something less tangible, something that had been layered over and over again until it became part of the structure itself. In the center of the room stood a single chair, its presence stark against the otherwise empty space, bolted firmly into the floor with thick metal brackets that showed no signs of having ever been loosened or removed. The chair faced the wall directly, positioned at a precise distance as though its placement had been calculated rather than chosen, leaving no room for variation or adjustment. Its surface was worn smooth in some places and deeply scratched in others, the marks clustered around the edges where hands might have gripped too tightly, where pressure might have been applied over long periods of time. There were no straps attached to it now, no visible restraints, but the design itself suggested that they had once been there, removed or decayed long after they had served their purpose. Rohan's gaze shifted slowly from the chair to the wall it faced, and the moment his eyes settled on its surface, something inside him tightened. The padded layers there were more damaged than anywhere else in the room, torn open in long, jagged strips that exposed the material beneath, and across those exposed sections were marks, hundreds of them, overlapping, crossing over one another in chaotic patterns that spoke not of random movement, but of sustained, repeated action. Fingernail marks. Deep ones. Some shallow and scattered, others carved so forcefully that they had cut through the top layers entirely, leaving grooves that ran vertically, horizontally, diagonally, without any consistent direction, as though whoever had made them had been driven by something far stronger than intention or control. In certain places, the edges of the marks were darker, stained in a way that suggested more than just wear, the discoloration uneven and layered, as if it had built up over time rather than appearing all at once. The sheer number of them made it difficult to focus on any single detail. They blurred together into a surface that looked less like a wall and more like a record. A physical imprint of something that had happened there again and again, each mark adding to a history that had never been erased. Rohan stepped further into the room, his movements slower now, more cautious, as though the space demanded it, and the moment he crossed the threshold completely, the air changed. It wasn't just a shift in temperature, though the room did feel noticeably colder than the corridor outside. It was something denser, something that pressed against him from all sides, making the space feel smaller than it was, more confined, as though the boundaries of the room existed not just in its walls but in the atmosphere itself. Breathing felt different here, heavier, each inhale carrying a weight that hadn't been present before, as if the air held something unseen that resisted being disturbed. The silence, which had followed him in from the corridor, settled differently here as well. It wasn't stretched thin or tense like before. It was compact, concentrated, as though it had been compressed over time into something almost solid. For a moment, nothing happened. The stillness held, unbroken, the room existing in a state that felt suspended, waiting. And then the crying returned. It didn't creep in gradually like it had before, didn't build from a faint whisper into something recognizable. It was immediate. Present and full from the very first moment, filling the room with a sound that was no longer distant or muffled but raw, exposed, and impossibly close. It carried a depth that hadn't been there before, layers of voices overlapping and intersecting in ways that made it difficult to separate one from another, each sob distinct yet connected, forming a chorus that felt too complex to belong to a single source. Rohan's body reacted instantly, a sharp tension running through him as the sound wrapped around him, pressing in from all directions. His eyes moved quickly across the room, searching for a point of origin, for anything that might anchor the sound to something physical. The walls remained still. The chair remained empty. The space around him showed no sign of movement. And then he realized something that made the tension in his chest tighten further. The sound wasn't coming from the room itself. It wasn't emerging from the walls, or the floor, or any visible point within his field of vision. It was coming from behind him. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he began to turn, his movements measured, controlled, as though part of him already understood that whatever lay behind him would not fit into the explanations he had relied on for so long. The crying followed the motion, maintaining its position relative to him, staying just out of sight, just beyond the edge of his vision. It didn't shift within the room. It shifted with him. And in that moment, as the realization settled in fully, clear and unavoidable, a single thought rose to the surface of his mind, cutting through everything else with a clarity that left no room for denial. He wasn't hearing the sound from somewhere in the space. He had stepped into the place it came from. He turned slowly, every instinct telling him to expect something, to see movement, a figure, a shadow breaking away from the corner of the room, but there was nothing there, nothing waiting behind him, nothing occupying the space where the sound should have been. The doorway stood open just as he had left it, the corridor beyond still and empty, its silence untouched by what he was hearing. For a brief, disorienting moment, that absence felt worse than if something had been there, because it stripped away the last fragile layer of explanation he had been holding on to. And as he stood there, caught between what he could see and what he could hear, the crying began to change. It didn't just grow louder, it deepened. Expanded, filling the room in a way that made it feel smaller, more enclosed, as though the sound itself was taking up space, pressing inward from all sides. It was no longer a single, indistinct sob but a layered chorus of voices, overlapping and intertwining in ways that made it impossible to isolate one from another. Men, women, children, each voice carried its own texture, its own tone, some sharp and panicked, others low and exhausted, some breaking apart mid-sob while others continued in long, drawn-out waves of grief. The sheer number of them was overwhelming, their presence stacking on top of one another until the room seemed saturated with emotion, each cry adding to a collective weight that settled heavily in the air. But there was something even more unsettling than the number of voices. They weren't random. They weren't chaotic. Beneath the surface of their individual distress, there was a pattern, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore once it became clear. The crying followed a rhythm. Not perfectly synchronized, not mechanical, but structured in a way that suggested something guiding it, shaping it, pulling each voice into alignment with the others. It rose and fell in waves, building and receding with an eerie consistency, like a chorus that had learned to mimic disorder while still obeying an underlying order. The effect was deeply unnatural, because it turned something inherently personal, grief, pain, fear, into something shared, collective, controlled. Rohan felt it before he fully understood it, a tightening in his chest, a subtle shift in his breathing as his body began to react to the rhythm without his permission, his heartbeat trying to find its place within the pattern. His senses adjusting to the unnatural cadence filling the room. The sound pressed against him from every direction, slipping past the boundaries of his hearing and settling somewhere deeper, somewhere internal. And then, just as his mind began to struggle under the weight of it, something changed. One voice separated from the rest. It didn't happen abruptly, not like a sound being isolated or amplified. It was more like the others receded slightly, pulling back just enough to create space, to allow a single thread to emerge from the tangled mass. The shift was subtle but deliberate, drawing his attention without force, guiding it towards something specific. The voice was softer than the others. Quieter, but far more distinct. It carried a clarity that cut through the surrounding noise, its tone trembling in a way that felt intimate, immediate, as though it wasn't part of the room but directed at him. "Please. Make it stop." The words were barely above a whisper, fragile and strained, each syllable carrying a weight that felt far heavier than its volume suggested. Rohan's breath caught in his throat, his body reacting instantly, a sharp, involuntary tension locking his muscles in place. There was something about the voice that didn't just register as sound but as recognition, a familiarity that surfaced before he could stop it, before he could rationalize it away. His mind searched for an explanation, something to ground the sensation, to place it outside of himself, but the more he listened, the clearer it became. The tone, the cadence, the slight break between words, it wasn't just similar to something he had heard before. It was identical. A cold realization began to form, slow but undeniable, spreading through him in a way that made it difficult to breathe, difficult to think. Because the voice wasn't coming from someone else. It wasn't an echo of another person's pain, or a fragment of some past event replaying itself within the room. It was his own. The recognition settled in fully, sharp and inescapable, stripping away the last barrier between him and what he was experiencing. The voice that had just spoken. The one that had broken away from the chorus, the one that had asked for the sound to stop, it belonged to him. Not just in tone or resemblance, but in every detail, every nuance that made it uniquely his. It wasn't an imitation. It wasn't a distortion. It was exact. And the moment that truth took hold, the rest of the voices surged back in, the rhythm tightening, the chorus swelling around him once more, but now it felt different, heavier, more focused. Because it wasn't just a collection of others anymore. It was something that had learned him, something that had reached into his own sense of self and pulled out a piece of it, shaping it into sound, into presence, into something that existed outside of him yet was undeniably his. And as the layered cries continued to rise and fall, filling the room with a rhythm that refused to break, one thought pressed itself into his mind with quiet, terrifying clarity. This place didn't just echo pain. It understood it. And once it did, it knew exactly how to make it its own. The recordings were found weeks later, long after Rohan had stopped responding to calls, long after the last message he sent, an incomplete voice note filled with static, had been replayed and dissected more times than anyone cared to admit, and long after the local authorities had reluctantly agreed to search the outskirts where his last known location had been traced. What they recovered wasn't a complete account, not a clean narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, but fragments, broken pieces of footage pulled from a damaged camera, sections corrupted, others intact just enough to be understood. The visual data, when assembled, didn't show anything that could immediately explain what had happened. There were no figures in the background, no sudden movements, no distortions in the frame that suggested something unnatural. The footage was steady, grounded, almost disappointingly ordinary in its composition. It showed Rohan standing alone in a small, square room, the same room described in the fragments of his notes, his back occasionally turned to the camera, his posture shifting in ways that, at first glance, could be mistaken for confusion or disorientation. He moved slowly, sometimes pacing in tight circles, sometimes standing completely still, his head tilted slightly as though listening to something that wasn't being captured. As the footage progressed, those movements changed. Subtle at first, barely noticeable shifts in his posture became more pronounced. His shoulders tightened, his hands trembled, his breathing, visible in the slight rise and fall of his chest, grew uneven. Then came the first clear break. He doubled over slightly, one hand rising to his head, fingers pressing against his temple as though trying to block something out. His mouth moved, forming words that couldn't be heard, his expression tightening into something strained, something pained. Moments later, the change became undeniable. He began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled kind, but something rawer, more immediate, his body reacting in ways that seemed to bypass conscious control. His shoulders shook, his posture collapsed inward, and the soundless footage showed him opening his mouth in what was clearly a scream, the force of it visible in the tension of his neck, the strain in his jaw. He stumbled backward at one point, nearly losing his balance before catching himself against the padded wall, his movements erratic, uncoordinated, as though he were responding to something that wasn't present in the visual frame. Then came the moments that made the footage difficult to watch, even without sound. Rohan dropped to his knees in front of the chair, his body folding in on itself, his hands clutching at his head, his shoulders shaking more violently now. His mouth moved again, forming repeated phrases, his expression shifting between panic and desperation. At one point, he leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the wall covered in deep, overlapping marks, his hands splayed out on either side as though trying to steady himself against something that couldn't be seen. The camera captured all of it with an unblinking clarity, every movement, every shift in posture, every visible sign of distress. And yet, for all its detail, it showed nothing that could explain why any of it was happening. There was no visible cause. No external trigger. Just a man alone in a room, unraveling in real time. It would have been easy, if not for the audio, to dismiss it as a psychological break, an isolated incident triggered by stress, isolation, or some unseen factor unrelated to the location itself. But the audio told a different story. From the very first seconds of playback, it was clear that what had been captured went far beyond the limits of a single human voice. The moment the recording began, the sound was already present, not building, not emerging, but existing fully, as though it had been ongoing long before the camera had started capturing it. It was layered, dense, composed of countless voices overlapping in a way that made it impossible to distinguish where one ended and another began. Men, women, children, each voice carrying its own tone, its own emotional weight, yet all bound together in a continuous stream of sound that filled every available space. The cries varied in intensity. Some sharp and immediate, others drawn out and exhausted, but none of them faded completely. They remained, cycling in and out of prominence, creating a constant presence that never fully diminished. At times, individual voices would surface briefly above the others, fragments of words breaking through, pleas, fragmented sentences, repeated phrases, but before they could be fully understood, they were pulled back into the larger mass, absorbed once again into the layered chorus. Beneath it all, almost hidden beneath the overwhelming presence of the crying, there was something else. It wasn't immediately noticeable, subtle enough to be missed on a casual listen, but once detected, it became impossible to ignore. A low, steady hum, consistent in its tone, running beneath the voices like a foundation. It didn't fluctuate or respond to the cries above it. It remained constant, unwavering, as though it existed independently of them. The quality of it was difficult to define. It wasn't mechanical in the traditional sense. There was no rhythm to it, no variation that suggested machinery or external equipment. Instead, it carried a strange organic quality, something that felt less like a sound being produced and more like something inherent to the environment itself. When the audio was isolated and analyzed, that hum remained, present even in moments where the crying dipped in intensity, steady and unbroken. Some described it as background noise, an artifact of the recording equipment or the environment. Others, after listening more closely, found it harder to dismiss. Because the longer it played, the more it seemed to resemble something familiar. Not in a way that could be easily identified, but in a way that felt instinctive, something the body recognized before the mind could interpret it. It rose and fell ever so slightly, not enough to be called a pattern, but enough to suggest movement, continuity. And once that realization settled in, it became difficult to hear it as anything else. It sounded like breathing. Not fast, not labored, but slow and steady, as if something large, something encompassing, was drawing in air and releasing it in an endless, unbroken cycle. And when that interpretation took hold, when the hum was no longer just a sound but something that resembled a living process, the rest of the recording shifted in meaning along with it. Because it suggested that the voices, the countless overlapping cries captured on the audio, weren't just existing within the building. They were part of it. And the building itself wasn't as empty as it appeared. Years later, long after the asylum had been sealed off again and the fragments of Rohan's recordings had quietly circulated among a small circle of researchers and archivists, someone finally managed to uncover what little remained of Ross Island Asylum's past, not in official government files, because those had been thoroughly erased, but in scattered, overlooked documents buried in private collections, mislabeled storage boxes, and the personal notes of individuals who had once been connected to the facility and had chosen, for reasons unknown, not to destroy everything they knew. The information was incomplete, inconsistent in places, and heavily fragmented, but when pieced together carefully, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that redefined everything Ross Island Asylum had ever been believed to be. It wasn't a hospital. Not in the conventional sense, not in the way it had been presented to the outside world or even to the families of those who had been sent there. It had never been designed primarily for treatment, recovery, or rehabilitation. Those functions, where they existed at all, had been secondary, a surface-level justification for something far more focused and far more deliberate beneath it. Ross Island Asylum had been an experiment. Not an experiment on the structure of the mind in the way most psychiatric institutions of the time approached their work. Not centered on cognition, behavior, or neurological patterns. Its focus had been narrower and, in many ways, far more abstract. It had been built around a single, controversial premise, that extreme emotional states, particularly those rooted in grief, fear, and sustained distress, were not just psychological experiences but forms of energy that could be isolated, contained, and, under the right conditions, preserved. The theory itself had been dismissed by most of the mainstream scientific community, regarded as speculative at best and fundamentally flawed at worst, but within a smaller, more secretive group of researchers, it had gained enough traction to justify further exploration. Ross Island Asylum had been the result of that exploration, a controlled environment where those ideas could be tested without oversight, without interference, and without the ethical constraints that would have prevented such work in any recognized institution. The crying room had been central to that design. It wasn't an improvised space or a later addition. It had been planned from the beginning, constructed with specific materials and structural considerations intended to serve a singular purpose. The reinforced door, the layered padding, the controlled dimensions of the room, every detail had been calibrated to create an environment where external variables could be minimized and internal responses could be intensified. Patients selected for these trials were not chosen randomly. The limited record suggests that they were individuals already experiencing heightened emotional states, people whose psychological conditions made them more susceptible to prolonged distress, more likely to reach the extremes that the researchers were attempting to study. Once inside the room, they were subjected to a series of auditory stimuli designed to trigger and sustain those emotional states. Continuous crying sounds were played through concealed systems embedded within the walls, not at a constant volume, but in carefully modulated patterns that mimicked real human distress. The recordings were layered, altered, and looped in ways that made them difficult to distinguish from genuine sound, creating an environment where the line between external stimulus and internal perception began to blur. Over time, as exposure continued without interruption, the patient's responses intensified. Sleep deprivation, sensory disorientation, and prolonged emotional stress combined to push their mental states beyond normal thresholds, leading to breakdowns that were both psychological and physiological. The researchers documented these changes meticulously, tracking not just behavioral shifts but what they described as fluctuations in emotional output, a term that appears repeatedly in the recovered notes but is never fully defined. The goal, according to these documents, was not simply to observe these responses, but to determine whether they could be captured in a measurable way, whether the environment itself could act as a medium through which this emotional energy could be retained. The room was designed to facilitate that process. The padding, replaced repeatedly over time, was not just for containment or safety, but part of an ongoing attempt to find materials capable of absorbing and holding on to these projected states. Each replacement marked a new phase of testing, a new variation in composition, as the researchers adjusted their methods in response to the results they were observing. And for a time, according to the records, they believed it was working. There are references to measurable changes within the room itself, subtle shifts in acoustics, variations in recorded sound patterns that could not be directly traced back to the input systems, anomalies that suggested something within the environment was beginning to interact with the stimuli rather than simply contain it. The language used in these notes becomes increasingly uncertain as they progress, the tone shifting from clinical precision to something more speculative, more cautious. It is clear that at some point, the researchers began to observe effects they had not anticipated. The room did not remain a passive container. It did not simply store the emotional output it was exposed to. It began to reflect it, to reproduce it in ways that were not directly tied to the original recordings. There are mentions of sounds being detected within the room even when the audio systems were inactive, of patterns emerging in the recordings that did not match any programmed input. Some entries describe the phenomenon as residual, others as reactive, but none provide a definitive explanation. What is consistent across these accounts is the acknowledgement that the room had changed. It was no longer functioning as intended. The boundary between stimulus and response had broken down, replaced by something more complex, something that suggested the environment itself had begun to internalize what it was exposed to. The final entries in the recovered documents are the most fragmented, their content incomplete, their conclusions unresolved. But within those fragments, a single idea appears more than once, repeated in slightly different forms, as if multiple individuals had reached the same realization independently. The room did not just contain emotional states. It adapted to them. It retained patterns, not just of sound, but of response, of reaction, of expression. In the language of the final report, stripped of its earlier certainty and precision, the conclusion is left unfinished, the sentence breaking off mid-thought as though the writer had either been interrupted or had chosen not to complete it. But the implication is clear enough. The room had moved beyond its original purpose. It had not simply stored what it was given. It had learned from it. The asylum has since been sealed, its remaining entrances reinforced, the surrounding land quietly marked as restricted, its existence reduced once again to something that officially does not exist, a structure removed from records and memory with the same careful precision that had once hidden its true purpose. Or at least, that is what those responsible would have people believe. Over time, the overgrowth returned, swallowing the outer walls and layers of creeping vegetation, the road leading to it breaking down further with each passing year until it became little more than a forgotten stretch of uneven ground that most travelers avoided without ever knowing why. To anyone passing by during the day, there is nothing particularly remarkable about it, just another abandoned structure in a landscape that has long since moved on. But the stories don't come from those who pass during the day. They come from the ones who stop. The ones who linger. The ones who find themselves drawn, for reasons they cannot fully explain, to pull over along that quiet, desolate road after sunset, when the world feels just a little too still and the distance between sounds feels just a little too wide. At first, there is nothing. Just the usual quiet of an isolated place at night, the distant hum of insects, the occasional movement of leaves in the dark, the soft shift of air that carries no clear direction. It feels normal, almost reassuring in its familiarity. And then, if they stay long enough, if they let that silence settle fully around them, they begin to notice something else. It starts faint, so faint that it barely registers as anything more than a subtle disturbance in the background, a sound that could easily be dismissed as imagination or misinterpretation. A soft, distant crying. It doesn't come from any specific direction, not from the ruins themselves, not from the surrounding land. It simply exists within the space, just at the edge of perception, present enough to be noticed but distant enough to be doubted. Most people ignore it at first. They shift their attention elsewhere, convince themselves it's the wind, an animal, something natural and explainable. But the longer they remain, the harder it becomes to maintain that explanation. Because the sound doesn't behave the way it should. It doesn't fade or shift with distance. It doesn't rise and fall in response to the environment. Instead, it remains consistent, steady, as though it is anchored not to a location but to the listener themselves. And then comes the part that unsettles them the most, the moment when uncertainty turns into something far more difficult to dismiss. The crying begins to change. Not in volume, not in intensity, but in clarity. The longer they listen, the more defined it becomes, the more distinct its tone, until it no longer feels like a distant, anonymous sound. It begins to take on a shape, a familiarity that is subtle at first but grows stronger with each passing second. People have described it in different ways, but the pattern is always the same. It doesn't sound like a stranger. It doesn't carry the indistinct quality of an unknown voice. Instead, it feels personal, recognizable, like something they have heard before. Somewhere in their own lives, in a context they can't immediately place but can't deny. Some say it sounds like a friend. Others insist it resembles a family member. A few have gone as far as to claim it sounded like someone they had lost, someone they hadn't heard in years. But the most consistent detail, the one that appears in nearly every account, is the sense of closeness it carries. The voice doesn't feel distant. It feels near, intimate, as though it exists just beside them, just out of sight, occupying the same space without ever revealing itself. And if they make the mistake of listening longer, if they allow themselves to focus on it instead of pulling away, something else begins to happen. The sound resolves into words. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the indistinct crying forms into something more structured, more deliberate, until the listener can no longer pretend they don't understand what is being said. The phrase is always the same, repeated in a tone that carries a quiet, exhausted desperation. Please. Make it stop. By the time they reach that point, most people leave. They don't wait to hear more. They don't try to investigate further. Something instinctive takes over, something deeper than curiosity, urging them to get back into their vehicles, to put distance between themselves and the place as quickly as possible. And for many, that would have been the end of it. A strange experience, unsettling but contained, something they might eventually rationalize or dismiss. But for those who linger just a moment too long, for those who hesitate even briefly before leaving, there is one final detail that ensures they never forget what they experienced. Just as they turn away, just as they begin to create that distance, the crying stops. Completely. The sudden silence is abrupt, unnatural, cutting through the space with a finality that feels intentional. And in that silence, just before they manage to fully step away, just before they convince themselves it's over, they hear something else. Not crying. Not pleading. Something quieter. Closer. A whisper. It doesn't come from a distance. It doesn't travel through the air the way sound should. It appears right beside them, so close that it feels as though it originates from the space just behind their ear, its presence unmistakable and impossible to ignore. The tone is calm, steady, carrying none of the desperation that defined the cries before it. It isn't asking. It isn't begging. It is simply stating something, with a certainty that feels far more unsettling than any expression of fear. There's room for one more. And by the time they turn, by the time they react, by the time they try to locate the source of that voice, there is nothing there. No movement. No presence. Just the quiet road, the dark outline of the ruins in the distance, and the lingering sense that, for a brief moment, something had been aware of them. Watching. Waiting. And perhaps, most unsettling of all, recognizing them. Some places don't just hold darkness, they absorb it, layer by layer, moment by moment, until it becomes part of their very structure, something woven into the walls, the floors, the air itself, something that doesn't fade with time but deepens, settles, and waits. They don't remain empty, they change, shaped by everything that has ever been felt inside them, until the place itself is no longer just a location but a presence, quiet, patient, and aware in ways that are difficult to explain and even harder to ignore. So if you ever find yourself standing outside a place that feels wrong, a place where the air seems heavier than it should be, where every breath feels just slightly harder to take, where the silence doesn't feel natural but intentional, as if it's holding something back, listen to that instinct that tells you to step away. Because not all silence is safe, and not all emptiness is truly empty. Some places don't invite curiosity, they rely on it, drawing people closer not with force, but with the subtle pull of unanswered questions, the quiet suggestion that there's something worth discovering just beyond the surface. But the truth is, not everything that waits in the dark is meant to be understood. Some things exist precisely because they were never meant to be found, never meant to be opened, never meant to be experienced again. Because there are rooms in this world, hidden, forgotten, deliberately sealed away, that don't just echo what you bring into them. They take it. They hold on to it. They learn from it. And once they do, once they've felt it, once they've recognized it, they don't give it back. They don't forget. They don't let it fade. They keep it, preserving every fragment of fear, every trace of grief, every unspoken thought that lingers just beneath the surface. And the most unsettling part is not what those rooms have already taken, but what they might still be waiting to receive. Because once something like that begins to understand the shape of human fear, once it learns how it sounds, how it feels, how it breaks, it doesn't need to search for it anymore. It simply waits for it to come to them. And if you're not careful, if you step too close, if you listen just a moment too long, you might realize far too late that the place you thought you were observing has already begun to observe you in return. That the silence you thought surrounded you has already started to close in. And that whatever exists within those walls has already decided that you belong there just as much as everything else it has claimed. Because some rooms don't just echo your fear. They recognize it. They reshape it. They make it part of themselves. And once they do, they never let it go. So now, you know how it begins. Not with something obvious. Not with something loud. Just a moment. A feeling. A hesitation you can't quite explain. A knock you almost ignore, a space that doesn't feel right, a silence that feels watched, and maybe that's what connects all of this, not the places, not the people, but the moment. When something reaches out and waits for you to notice. Because once you do, you don't just walk away from it, you carry it with you, in the quiet, in the dark, in those small pauses. Where nothing is happening, but it still feels like something is there, and the unsettling part is, most people who experience this don't realize what it was. Until it's already too late. So tonight, when everything is still, and your surroundings feel just a little different, pay attention, not to what you can see, but to what you can't, because sometimes that's where it begins. If this stayed with you, even for a moment, you're exactly the kind of listener this channel was made for. Like the video, share it with someone who won't look at the dark the same way again, and subscribe to Shadow's Lair for more stories that don't end when the video does. And before you leave, tell me, what's the one moment you ignored that you still think about? I'll see you in the next one, if you're still listening.